This is it! The ultimate dimension for restin' stories, and it's called Sleepy Myths.
Every memory has a color and a weight. Some are as light as a sunbeam on dust, a pale yellow of a shared joke. Others are heavy, a deep, silent blue that feels cool in the palm of your hand, the color of a truth you weren't ready to hold. For Morty, most of these heavy memories lived not in his mind, but in a small, glowing vial on a shelf in his grandfather's garage. He wasn't supposed to remember them. But tonight the garage was quiet, and the hum of the ship was like a lullaby. We truly love and care for you, and we're so glad you are resting with us. Before we begin the story, tell us where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? Now find your comfortable spot, maybe pull a blanket a little closer, and let's get started. The house was smaller than he remembered, leaning a little more to one side, the paint gone from pale blue to the color of old bills left in a drawer. The porch creaked beneath his boots, but it was a familiar creak, like a voice clearing its throat before saying his name. The key stuck halfway in the lock. When it finally turned, the door released a breath of air that smelled of dust, motor oil, and something faintly sweet, like dried orange peel. Rick's house had never been cozy. Every surface used to carry evidence of restlessness, screws scattered into ashtrays, notebooks packed with diagrams, mugs labeled with dates instead of names. Morty set his bag down and stood on the threshold of the living room. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, steady and patient, keeping time with his own heartbeat. He had promised himself he could handle this trip, that it was just sorting through some things, clearing out what had been left behind. Nothing sentimental, just practical duty. But the air pressed against his ribs with the weight of all the afternoons he'd spent here, tracing the smell of solder and ozone up from the basement while Rick muttered equations to himself. Rain tapped at the windows. Late afternoon light muted through cloud folded around the furniture. The carpets looked unchanged, though the patterns had dulled and flattened with time. On the coffee table sat a burnt match and a coffee cup and a folded letter addressed to future idiot. Typical, he thought, managing a small smile. The stairs to the basement waited at the end of the hallway. He lingered because going down would make the past too real. The bulb at the top of the stairwell flickered weakly, throwing long shadows that trembled like ghosts trying to keep up. He pulled the chain. The bulb responded with a low hum, then steadied into that half-light golden enough to resemble memory. The smell grew stronger, metal and mildew, and a faint chemical tang that pulled him straight back to being 10 knees on cold concrete, watching Rick balance a circuit board on a stack of comic books. The basement door moaned open. Inside, time had been patient. Nothing looked stolen or broken, just paused. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with jars of screws, tangled wires, mechanical parts whose use he still couldn't guess. On the workbench lay a cluster of cassette tapes in brittle plastic cases, labeled in Rick's sharp block letters. T-hey, T-F-I-F-I-F-I-U-C-C-Sis, and another Mubelomars. The label sounded like a joke at first, a typical Rick flourish. But something in the handwriting had changed, uneven, slanted at the edges. It looked written by a man unsure whether to reveal or hide something. Morty's fingers hovered before picking one up. Dust lifted lightly, shimmered in the bulb's halo. He glanced toward the workbench socket, where the old cassette player still sat, power cord coiled like a sleeping snake. He pressed the plug in, feeling a little surge of absurd guilt, like he might be invading privacy he hadn't been invited to. Before pressing play, he looked around again. The air seemed thicker. Even the basement itself felt alert, as if everything in it waited for permission to exhale. The tape rolled. A faint hiss filled the room, followed by Rick's voice. Steady, older, gentler than Morty remembered. If you're hearing this, it means I never got around to destroying the evidence. Surprise, surprise. Maybe I changed my mind, or maybe you ignored my posthumous instructions. Good for you. If it's you listening, Morty, well, sit down. Some things I didn't trust myself to explain out loud. Morty sat slowly on the workbench stool. The cassette weared on. There are memories the brain edits to survive. You and I, we bought into that idea. But the real trick never was deleting pain. It was learning what to do when you remember it again. If these tapes reach you, I guess you're ready to remember. The voice paused, paper rustling in the background. I made mistakes you already know about, and more you don't. This isn't about apologies. Those are cheap. It's about cause and effect. You delete enough parts of yourself, you end up what I became, a mind full of empty rooms. The tape clicked off suddenly mid-sentence. He rewound, pressed play again. Same cut. No end. He sat there, listening to the static hiss like slow rain. For a long time, that sound was enough. He picked up the next cassette. Same label style, same dust. A faint pen smear near the corner, maybe from Rick's thumb. Beyond the furnace pipes, he spotted a trunk under a tarp. Tugging it free, he discovered dozens more tapes. Neat rows of them, categories scrawled in permanent marker. Jill I Ridgerite Piro JCP Adibu. BH. Fargun. His pulse climbed, but not from fear, from unlocking a door that had waited years for its key. He nodded to the silence as if to the old man himself. All right, he whispered. Let's see what you were hiding. The bulb flickered again, pulsing with the rhythm of an unseen heartbeat. Shadows stretched across the floor. Outside, thunder rolled, a low, approving murmur. The first drops of night rain began to streak the window high on the basement wall, each one catching light until they looked like burning threads sliding toward the earth. Morty pressed his palms against his knees. For the first time in years, he didn't feel angry or lost. Just curious in that old innocent way he'd thought he'd outgrown. He pressed play on the second tape. The hiss grew louder, filling the room like wind through dry leaves. Then Rick's voice again, softer, almost tired. You ever notice how the heart collects secrets the way a basement collects dust? Doesn't matter how many times you sweep, some of it always settles back. Static swallowed the next words. Morty didn't mind. The voice itself was a presence, something solid between the cracks. He let the player run until it clicked to an end. In the fading hum, he heard his own breath steady, slow, the faint drip of rain through the gutter outside, the electric whisper of the filament above him. He looked at the trunk again, imagining the stories sleeping inside each one. For the first time, the basement didn't feel haunted. It felt alive. The second tape waited in his hand, square and light, but somehow heavier than it should have been. The label said only January 14. First follow-up, nothing else. The handwriting had dipped near the end as though the pen itself sighed. He slid the cassette into the player. The mechanical click sounded louder this time, crisp against the hush of basement air. A soft whir, then the magnetic hiss swelling into a faint, unmistakable voice. Rick's older, years older than Morty remembered him ever sounding. Test run, be subject, self-reflection. Try not to sound like an idiot. A few seconds of silence, then the rasp of Rick's cigarette lighter. Let's talk about that summer. The one with the workshop fan and the smell of burnt solder. Morty, you were about 10, all elbows and big questions. The words pulled him backward before he could resist. The scene came alive exactly as described. He could smell the metallic residue of the workshop, feel the sticky texture of lemonade bottles sweating on the counter. Rick leaned over a table crowded with circuit boards, a pencil clamped between his teeth, murmuring measurements under his breath. Morty had been wearing a t-shirt 3 sizes too big. One sleeve singed from getting too close to whatever Rick was welding. Don't blink, Rick had said then, squinting into the spark. I'm not blinking. That's the spirit. Scientists don't flinch. They just learn what not to stare at too long. Morty smiled faintly at the memory now, the way grown-ups smile at old photographs. The tape continued. He kept handing me tools, even wrong ones. Did it to be part of the rhythm. Every time I fixed his mistake, he grinned like we'd invented something new. Maybe we did. He pressed pause. The silence of the basement washed over him. Steady, harmless, a tide that didn't need pulling back. Upstairs, a floorboard popped. The old house seemed to echo moods like a living body. He remembered those same movements from childhood. The house reacting to late nights, to experiments gone wrong, to louder muffled behind arguments. He unpaused. I used to let him think the machines mattered. Rick's voice continued. They didn't. Not really. The point was attention. When you give a kid your time, you're promising he's worth explaining the world to. I didn't keep that promise. The playback shuddered slightly from age, stretching the vowels into ghosts. Morty exhaled, lips tight. Rick had never said such things while alive. Praise and self-reflection were foreign currencies in his mouth. He looked around the basement. Half a museum, half purgatory. Shelves of motors he never understood, fragments of a dream that might have changed the world if it hadn't burned out on pride. He rewound a little and then played again, listening carefully to the breathing between words. Rick was talking into that microphone like he knew he'd never get another chance. There's a file labeled July Regret. Don't play that one yet. Build up to it. Truth Works Better stepped into slowly. The tape clicked off with finality. Morty stared at the machine. Somewhere in the wiring came a faint electrical tick, a nervous heartbeat inside coated dust. He didn't stop the motion of his own thumb sliding the eject switch. The cassette door bared its teeth, and he caught himself whispering thanks under his breath. He set that first tape beside him. Its plastic edges glittered faintly under the overhead bulb. Above the workbench, an old clock still hung, second hand jerking unevenly. 4:17 p.m., uncertain whether afternoon or memory. Outside, rain deepened. The drops on the small basement window turned the last daylight into a film reel of distortions. Through it, Morty could see the shape of the magnolia tree out front bending in the weather. He and Rick used to race under that same tree with wires stretched between soda cans, playing science. He scanned the trunk again. Rows of tapes like a grid of sleeping thoughts. Mandibula Warsval, 2 through 8 Beth. Audio test, Controlled Dreams 1989. He reached for the recorder's stop button and ran a sleeve across his forehead. The air had grown warm from the machine's motor. The temptation to keep going pulsed through him. But his pulse had already begun to align with the rhythm of those tapes. Listen, breathe, fade. Listen again. He stood, stretching, the stool scraping against concrete. The basement door stood cracked at the top of the steps, letting in a sliver of lemon-gray light from the kitchen. He walked up halfway to catch a breath of air unscented by rust. The world above seemed too silent, as though waiting for him to decide something. He looked back down. The light bulb trembled. The tapes gleamed faintly like tiny sleeping hearts. He went back down. Maybe he wouldn't listen to another tonight, maybe just one more. Maybe. He took the tape labeled Test Ron C. Behavioral Observations Summer 2007. Not what Rick had advised, but curiosity was a habit that didn't take orders anymore. Tension fluttered behind his ribs. The quiet type. Not fear, but that small flutter just before a new truth walks through the door. He pressed the tape in, click play, static. Then a shuffle and something that sounded eerily like laughter. His own when it was still unbroken by cynicism. Day 4. Rick's voice muttered, half smiling. Results inconclusive. He still believes in people. I'll let it ride. A thunderclap stitched the space between the lines. Morty froze. That line, it wasn't data. It was personal. Rick cataloging optimism like a specimen and deciding to let it live. The recording stopped abruptly mid-sentence again, leaving only the hum of the cassette wheel. Morty sat on the cold floor, elbows resting on knees, palms open as if waiting for an answer. And in the flickering glow, he finally understood that these weren't just confessions. They were experiments in remorse, lessons disguised as tapes. Thunder rolled away in the distance, each rumble smaller, slower, softer. He pressed stop, rewound, placed the cassette neatly beside the first one. The two tapes sat together, edges touching like brothers forgiven after years apart. He shut off the basement light. The last glow of the bulb faded to a coal orange pinpoint. The hum of the old refrigerator upstairs stabbed through the silence, a reminder that life carried on somewhere above, unrecorded. Morty breathed in the still air. Each inhale drew in dust, rain scent, the faint metallic tang of old time. The basement door closed with a gentle click, and upstairs, he could swear he heard the very first sound of dawn hiding inside that rain. Each time morning light touched the garage windows, it woke the dust before it woke anyone else. The motes lifted lazily, twisting through the pale beams that cut across shelves of metal, rubber, glass jars. Behind that haze of half-light, the place smelled of oil, hot glue, lemon-scented detergent. Rick pretended masked everything. It didn't. Nothing really masked the scent of solder, of burnt patience and ideas that almost worked. On those Sundays, Morty had been smaller, a shape crouched near the workbench, brown sneakers dangling above the floor. Outside, other kids shot hoops or coasted downhill on their bikes while Morty sorted washers by size, pretending it mattered. Rick's hand, sharp-knuckled and steady, would hover beside him, reaching for parts faster than any eye could track. Pass me the 3/8 wrench. Morty scavenged in the puzzle of tools, offered a spanner far too big. Rick grunted. Traded it for the right one. Close enough. Tenacity counts more than precision when you don't know the difference yet. Back then, the compliment felt enormous, a medal hidden in sarcasm. He'd rediscover it years later, unwrapped of irony, realizing Rick meant to praise, wasn't sure how. Morty used to count hours by the rhythm of the fan. The crook thing creaked every third rotation. Creak, pause, rattle. Just enough pattern to feel safe. Sometimes Rick sang along under his breath. A line or two from some rock anthem that Morty was too young to know but old enough to hum out of tune. In those moments, they weren't mad scientist and sidekick. They were just two people making a racket no one else wanted to hear. The tape from the day before still sat on the kitchen table upstairs now, but Sundays in the workshop came back without it. Memory had its own player built under the ribs, no off switch. Morty eased onto the old stool, its foam split creases etched by time. He pulled open a drawer. Inside lay bits of copper, screws rusted orange around the heads, and a single screwdriver etched with his initials MS in crooked child letters. Rick had made him carve them himself. Said every tool deserved to know who depended on it. Morty rolled it between his fingers, tracing that groove of initial marks. He could smell 10 again, sunburnt, hungry, halfway proud, halfway scared that he'd break something irreplaceable. Try balance, Rick's voice had said once, guiding his hands over the drill press. Science is everything teetering on compromise. Too much push and you ruin the bit. Too little and nothing happens. Life ain't different. He hadn't understood then. Now every memory returned with subtitles only age could translate. A drawer slammed too hard that day. A spring flew. It had clinked against the concrete, rolled into shadow like a secret fleeing capture. Rick muttered about entropy. Morty crawled under the bench, muttering apology. Fingers brushed the cool floor, searching. When he'd looked up, Rick was watching him, eyes softened by something close to affection. though it disappeared the second Morty noticed. "You don't stop when it breaks," Rick had said roughly. "That's the part people always mess up. You take the broken edge. Measure why it broke and start smaller next time." Later, they took lunch on the step outside the garage. Sandwiches stacked haphazardly, mustard bleeding into braid. Rick poured cola into his coffee mug as if disguise made it respectable. They watched neighborhood streetlights flicker on, the town humming quietly under the weight of a Sunday afternoon winding down. Morty remembered that silence so clearly now, the one where conversation wasn't needed, where understanding lived in the gaps. He traced the heel of his palm across a beam of dust light, letting sparkles of floating debris gather and scatter around it. The workshop was a snow globe of frozen effort, awaiting a shake. The house upstairs creaked with expansion. Outside, a bird chirped twice. Tentative, unsure if spring had really committed. Morty laughed softly at the thought of nature needing reassurance, too. He imagined what Rick would say. "Birds don't doubt, kid. They test the air pressure." He looked around, half expecting that gruff smirk to be hovering over his shoulder again. There was no point wishing. Missing wasn't productive, and Rick would have hated unproductive sentiment. Yet Morty noticed that even the logic of grief obeyed its own eccentric physics. He began clearing the desk, grouping bolts, snapping lids on jars. Each clang of metal was punctuation in a conversation with memory. He found an old photo taped to the inner side of a cabinet door himself, maybe 12, holding up a crook model plane, Rick beside him unsmiling but clearly pleased. The edges of the photo had curled inward, clinging to time. Beneath it, scrawled in red marker, 2 words, "depth of attempts." Morty kept staring till letters blurred. He sat back, let arms fall limp, hearing rain establish a slow beat on the roof. If he squinted through the small window, the street looked nearly the same: cracked driveway, telephone pole scarred with staples from ancient flyers. The difference sat inside him, a quieter heartbeat, a patience inherited without instruction. When Rick had gone, he hadn't left notes on how to live, he'd left objects that implied them. Machines unfinished, tools arranged almost like sentences missing verbs. Now the meaning returned gradually, one object at a time, each decoding itself. A wrench clanked to the floor. Morty flinched, then laughed. Even empty rooms corrected posture like teachers you thought extinct. He stayed until twilight bruised the windows. In that blue half-light, every surface softened. Shadows turned mutual. Even the rust seemed gentle, as if forgiving all the years of neglect. Morty placed the photo on top of the bench in plain view. No longer a relic, but a reminder of what working with your hands once meant. He could almost hear Rick's chair scraping, that familiar mutter. "Focus on your variables, kid," Morty whispered back. "I am?" For the first time in a while, the garage felt less like history and more like a promise shaping itself anew. The fan turned once on a leftover surge of power from some forgotten circuit. A slow, lazy spin, whimpering creak. Creak, pause, a rattle. He smiled. When he turned to leave, his reflection in the window startled him. Older, yes, but something of that buzz-eyed kid still lingered around the jaw, around the quiet defiance of keeping curiosity alive. That was the real inheritance. Not formulas, not gadgets, but the habit of asking anyway. He switched off the light. The fan gave one last half rotation before settling. Dust drifted free, luminous in the remaining shaft of sun, spinning in place like proof that even still things could move if you looked long enough. Morty stood at the door, hand on the knob, holding the moment steady just a breath more before stepping back into the corridor of dim hallways and muffled rain. He thought of the trunk downstairs waiting with its melancholy cargo, of the next cassette labeled "The Secret" between shelves. There would be answers there, maybe apologies, maybe both. But for now the workshop had given him enough. He closed the garage door behind him quietly, a gesture of respect. The latch clicked, the wind sighed against the siding, and somewhere beneath the floorboards the house seemed to nod. The fourth evening arrived with a bruised purple sky, the kind of cloudy dusk that looks like it's thinking about rain but keeps changing its mind. Morty had spent the day sorting through cardboard boxes, pulling up small tombstones of memory, mismatched socks, a toy robot without arms, the framed photo of Rick at some science fair in the 80s, hair wild and grin wider. He told himself he would stop after dinner. Then, as though guided by habit older than reason, his legs brought him back to the basement again. The air waited. He snapped the cord of the light, then stared at that familiar flicker. The bulb's pulse like the quick blink of someone deciding whether to tell a secret. The workbench still smelled of warm metal, the hum of the little cassette player an accidental metronome to his own heartbeat. There were tapes he hadn't touched yet. He took one marked "The Secret" between shelves. It looked newer, almost clean. Written in bright green marker instead of Rick's usual black, the letters slanted upward, like hope mid-stride. He pressed play. "You were still small enough to think eavesdropping made you brave," Rick's voice confessed after a crackle. "You thought I didn't know?" But the kid in the hallway heard what adults pretend not to say. Static swallowed him for a second, then the sound of footsteps, 2 adult tones raised. Not yelling, just the sharp rhythm of disagreement. Morty didn't need names. He remembered that day instantly, the muffled argument that had changed how rooms felt in the house. He'd been crouched between the pantry shelves, hand on the cool box of cereal, listening to something about a promise. A broken one? Through the playback, he could hear his mother's voice, younger, defiant. "You can't just erase what happened, Dad. He deserves to know who you were before." Then Rick, tired but steel-edged. "He deserves to grow up before he judges it." Pause, interruption. "You call hiding that protection? I call it pacing. Exposure therapy." Something crashed then. Must have been the coffee mug Morty had once found with a crack down its handle. The tape caught Rick's low exhale, part laugh, part surrender. "If there's one thing I've learned," Rick murmured, "nothing breaks quietly forever." The playback wavered, silence stretching before his mother's voice came softer, breaking on the edge of tears. "One day he'll find out. And he'll love you anyway. That's what scares you, isn't it?" Then a long hiss, the abrupt click of the recorder shutting off. Morty's throat went dry. He stopped the tape, pushed it out of the player, stared at the label again. For years he'd remembered that day mostly as a shape. Andrew behind a door, footsteps. Then the loud hum of a car engine leaving. He hadn't realized Rick had been recording it. The basement tilted slightly around him. He pressed both palms to the workbench for balance. The rough grain bit gently into his skin, anchored to the present. He needed fresh air. Up the stairs, the hallway air carried its usual mix of house dust, forgotten spice jars, the faint smell of his mother's old perfume still embedded in the walls. He leaned against the frame of the living room doorway, eyes closed. The memory refused to fade. 10-year-old Morty, crouched between shelves, holding his breath, wishing adults would speak in sentences that didn't feel like explosions waiting for a fuse. He'd never told anyone he'd heard them. Not even Rick, not even when silence between them became standard language. He remembered creeping out only after hearing the door slam. His mother had sat on the couch, trembling, cup still steaming on the table beside her. She told him everything was fine. Kids know the difference between fine and finished. Now, hearing the recording in Rick's voice, he didn't know whether to call it betrayal or proof of something strangely tender. Rick trying to study emotion the way he'd study a reaction in a tube, terrified but determined not to look away from what hurt. Morty poured himself a glass of water in the kitchen. The faucet sputtered, coughed out a sound like half a laugh. He leaned against the counter, staring at the cracked linoleum Rick once promised he'd fix. Some promises were just timelines too short for intention. He went back down eventually, because avoiding the truth seemed pointless when half of it already sat spinning through magnetized ribbon below the floorboards. As soon as he stepped into the basement, the air changed again, denser, alert, almost alive with waiting. He picked up the tape, pressed play one more time, but this time listened closer. There was something just after the argument, something buried under static, a whisper, barely audible. Rick, muttering to himself one day, "Kid, I hope you hear this," and still walked back down the stairs. Morty froze outside. Rain struck the windows harder now. The sound blurred everything else. The heartbeat of weather drumming over the house like applause for a confession finally completed. He sat back, elbows on knees, head dropping into his palms. The flickering bulb above stuttered again, its rhythm sensing with the rain. Rick's whisper looped in his mind, "Still walk back down the stairs." That was the part that mattered, not the argument, not the guilt, but the faith hidden inside those words. After a while, he picked up a different tape from the trunk. One labeled July Regret, the one Rick had told him not to play yet. He turned it over in his hand, the plastic warm from the basement lamp. Not tonight, he thought. There were still smaller truths to build stamina with. He placed it back, closed the trunk gently, rested a hand on the lid a moment longer than needed, as though blessing it. When he finally shut the basement light, he didn't feel the usual ache of nostalgia. What filled him was quieter, steadier, the understanding that some secrets, when aired, don't destroy love, they clarify it. The old bulb dimmed to orange, then blinked out. Darkness covered the facing shelves, all those silent witnesses, each waiting for him to come back when ready. Upstairs, the rain softened to drizzle. Morty left the basement door open. Small act of rebellion or forgiveness, maybe both. He walked toward his old room, footsteps muffled by carpet older than he was. Somewhere in the half-dark house, wood expanded against humidity, popping softly. A sound easy to mistake for someone clearing their throat. He smiled without meaning to. "I heard you," he murmured. "And yeah, Rick, I came back down." The rain answered with a light patter, gentle applause fading as sleep drew close. The summer of the protest had settled into memory like pollen, fine, golden, and careless in where it landed. Morty didn't think about that summer often. It sat folded at the back of his mind. between the pages of teenage impatience and the first time he realized grown-ups could be wrong loudly. In those days, the town square was the heartbeat of everything. There had been news stories, leaflets pressed into palms at supermarkets, voices over megaphones that cracked from both righteous anger and heat. It started about water rights, someone had said, or taxation, or ethics in the plant across the highway. The reasons blurred. In small towns, reasons often do. But everybody needed something to believe was worth shouting for. Rick hadn't cared much about politics or slogans. People get loud when they're ignored. He'd muttered that morning, half to himself, half to Morty, while adjusting a bent pair of sunglasses. Problem is, everyone's ignoring each other at the same volume. Morty followed him downtown anyway, because at 17, there wasn't anyone else worth following. The signs looked homemade, paint still wet, letters bleeding into one another. Somebody played old rock music from a portable speaker, a strange backdrop for the chants. The tar on the streets shimmered, sticky enough to trap the day's heat like regret. Rick carried a small radio more complicated than functional, monitoring police channels. He said, though the dial needle had broken years ago, Morty suspected he wanted to keep his hands busy, not his conscience. At first, the protest had the rhythm of a summer fair, kids weaving through crowds, lemonade stands, laughter colliding with slogans. But noise attracts friction, and soon enough friction did what it always does. A bottle shattered. Somewhere behind them, someone screamed. A chain reaction of panic ran through the crowd, like dominoes falling with bones instead of plastic. Rick reacted first, yanking Morty aside, pulling him down an alley between the bakery and a closed hardware store. Flour dust leaked from a torn bag by the dumpster. It floated through sunlight like ghost confetti. Morty caught his breath just as two officers sprinted past the alley's mouth, shouting for calm. Neither of them looked calm. When the noise faded, Rick finally spoke. "Lesson number 1, he said, voice ragged. "No mob ever lasts without somebody losing track of why they came." Morty wanted to ask what lesson number 2 was, but Rick was already pacing. When they returned home hours later, the television was full of looping footage, broken banners, tear gas haze, people running in every direction. Beth stood by the screen, arms crossed, anger trembling under worry. "What were you thinking?" she demanded. "There were riots downtown." Rick didn't flinch, observing the species in its natural habitat. Beth's glare could have melted steel. "You took him." The argument burned through the night. Doors slammed, voices rose, the same sound of conviction colliding with pride. Morty had sat on the porch steps with a soda can warming in his hand, feeling the edges of adulthood press closer around him. Between the shouts, he caught Rick's voice through the wall saying something that would stick for years. If he's going to inherit this mess, he might as well see it firsthand now. In the present basement, the tape marked the summer protest stopped clicking and wheezed to an end. Morty sat back in the dim light, that memory unspooling across time with uncomfortable precision. His father had been the one hurt later that day, an elbow during the confusion, 6 stitches above the ear. Small injury, big symbol. It became the family's shorthand for that season. The summer your dad got stitched and your grandfather disappeared. He found himself muttering, 3 days. That was how long Rick had vanished after the protest. No calls, no notes, just absence strung tight across the family like a clothesline heavy with rain-soaked clothes. In the tape, faint static shifted, and then Rick's voice returned, quieter. "I didn't plan to run, kid. I just needed to see what the world looked like without me in it for 72 hours. Turns out the world didn't notice. That's the good and bad of being small on a big planet." Morty paused the player. That sounded like Rick trying to explain something he didn't have the vocabulary for. Loneliness dressed up as philosophy. He remembered his mother crying not because Rick had gone missing, but because she had expected it. Predictable heartbreak hurts worse. It denies you the dignity of surprise. Above him, the old house creaked at every sudden gust of wind. Rain slid down the basement window, tracing patterns that looked almost like handwriting if you stared long enough. The storm outside matched the one crawling across his memory. He pressed play again. "When I came back," Rick recorded, "I tried to convince them that nothing had changed. But absence rewires everything. Brains adapt to missing pieces faster than you think. You come home and find your spot already filled by the outline you left behind." Morty inhaled slowly. The words brushed against something raw inside him, that lingering fear of being forgotten, of being replaced by memory's convenience. He saw again the scene that had closed that summer. Rick stepping through the front door at dawn, mud up to his ankles, expression unreadable. He had gone straight to the workshop without speaking. Morty had followed but stopped at the doorway, watching his grandfather sit before the cluttered bench, pick up a screwdriver, and twist it in silence for an hour. The same screwdriver still lay there. Morty had found it beside the cassette trunk days ago. He reached for it now. Metal cool against the heel of his palm. It carried a weight out of proportion for its size. "If you're listening, Morty," Rick's voice concluded faintly, "don't waste years trying to fix the crowd. Fix the few hearts that actually listen." Click. End of side A. Morty didn't bother flipping to side B. The message already filled the room. He sat still, letting time breathe around him. The basement smelled faintly of ozone from the storm. Each flash of lightning outside painted quick silver stripes across the concrete floor. There had been so much noise that day years ago. Horns, chance argument. And yet the part that stayed loudest was the moment of quiet afterward, when everything paused, waiting to see if humanity would find its balance again. Rick had always claimed experiments matter only if repeated. Here Morty was repeating, testing whether forgiveness can stabilize what anger once combusted. He returned the tape gently to its case, set it with the others. The storm began to pass, raindrops softened to a whisper against glass. He turned off the basement light and waited in that brief dark where vision adjusts and shape becomes meaning. Somewhere in the silence there was another noise, an echo of people shouting in the distance, then clapping, then laughter. Memory replaying, history rehearsing itself in miniature. Morty whispered into the dark, almost smiling. "Lesson number 2, huh?" No answer came, only the small, approving creak of the house settling deeper into night. He climbed the stairs slowly, turning the knob to close the basement behind him. Not shutting it out, but sealing the memory with care, like one more glass jar on a shelf labeled "Understood." Outside, thunder rolled its long farewell. The morning started gray but not unkind. A flat, patient light draped the kitchen and made everything look freshly washed. The faucet, the old tiles, even the stack of unopened mail that had gone yellow around the edges. Morty sat at the table with a pen that didn't write and a thought that wouldn't quiet. He'd stayed awake long after the storm ended, listening to the house sigh through its rafters. When the thunder finally dissolved, a restless hush took its place, a silence that felt expectant, like a question waiting for the right page to be found. So he'd come down with coffee, planning to clear a few things before heading home. That plan changed when he opened the drawer near the refrigerator. At first, all he saw were napkins, coupons from a grocery chain that no longer existed, and a stiff envelope face down at the back. The paper was beige and rough, the kind that absorbed ink too quickly. He turned it over. On the front, in Rick's unmistakable slanted block letters, "Beach, not to be mailed." Morty's breath shortened a fraction. Beneath it were 3 more, "Suam Mar. For someday, Marty, why? If I ever forget," and one with no name at all. He set them side by side on the kitchen table, forming a rough rectangle of half-spoken thoughts. The first envelope was sealed with tape that had lost its stick. The flap lifted easily, as though permission had been there all along. Inside lay 2 folded sheets, the ink on them faint with time but legible. "Beth, if you're reading this, either I got brave or bored. Maybe both. Nothing I say here fixes the years I wasn't you'd think I'll father. But sometimes anger comes from lessons learned too late, and I don't trust myself to speak them out loud." Morty felt heat creep up the back of his neck as he realized what he held. Rick's attempt at apology translated into paper. He forced himself to keep reading. "You were always better at building things that stay together. Don't waste that gift doubting whether you deserved better parents. You did. I tried anyway. R." The second page was blank except for a scribble near the bottom. "P.S. Tell the boy curiosity isn't a flaw." Morty folded the letter back carefully, as if its creases were fragile bones. "Tell the boy." Rick had written, too sure he'd never actually do it. The letter to Summer was shorter, almost playful. Rick had drawn a small doodle of Saturn in the corner and written, "Don't grow up smart instead of kind. The universe already has enough of me." No salutation, no signature, just that single line. Morty sat staring at both letters for a long while. The air in the kitchen felt different now. Not lighter, just truer. Like the space between confession and forgiveness, which wasn't about relief so much as recognition. He picked up his own envelope. "Morty, why? If I ever forget." The seal was intact. His thumb hesitated on the edge. "Curiosity has gravity, it pulls first, reasons later." He tore it open and unfolded the single page. "Kid, there will come a day when I don't remember what I taught you, or I'll pretend I don't to make it easier for both of us. When that happens, remind yourself what you already know, you're not an experiment. You never were." Rick had drawn a small circuit diagram beneath the sentence, then crossed it out. Turns out feelings can't be quantified. Who knew? "If I forget, make sure you don't." Morty wiped at his eyes before he realized they'd blurred. Everything above the signature was shaky, as if written with a hand that no longer trusted itself. He reread the last line, "Make sure you don't," and pictured Rick at the table years ago, probably under this same muted morning, scratching words that embarrassed him even in solitude. The unnamed envelope remained, slightly heavier. He slid the opening with his thumb. Inside was a single Polaroid of family barbecue, the one where Rick had burned the burgers so badly the smoke alarm went off, and everyone laughed until they coughed. On the back, in faint graphite, proof things worked once. Morty turned the photo over again and studied the moment. Beth mid-laugh, Summer tugging on his sleeve, Rick pretending not to smile. They all looked unguarded, caught in the spill of sunlight that softened everyone's edges. A sound downstairs, wind through the vent, or imagination, reminded him of the tapes. There were still so many unplayed, entire worlds waiting within inches of magnetic strip. But for now these letters felt like their summary, handwritten epilogues to the scientist who couldn't say, "I miss you," without inventing a new language first. He sealed each envelope, stacked them carefully inside a clean plastic container, and labeled it Confidence P. Then he opened the window above the sink, letting real air cross the room for the first time in years. The town outside was waking, garbage truck groaning a few blocks off, sparrows gossiping on power lines. Normal noises that for once didn't feel intrusive. Morty leaned his elbows on the counter and watched clouds thinning over the magnolia tree. There was something unexpectedly comforting about the way light returned without permission. He looked back at the letters, all tidy again, and understood Rick hadn't mailed them because no reply could have satisfied him. It wasn't about closure, it was about witness. Some truths just needed to be seen, even if only once. He gathered his cup and tapped the folded edges of the envelopes until they aligned. Somewhere deep in his chest, that old ache of wanting to fix what time corrodes softened. He could almost hear Rick's dry, impatient voice saying, "Don't get poetic about it, kid. Just read, learn, and move." Morty smiled. "I am moving," he said into the quiet. He placed the container beside the tapes in the basement later that night, where the steady hum of the old fridge overhead sang its eternal low note. Before turning out the light, he whispered toward the shelf, "You didn't forget everything, old man. You just wrote it down and ran out of nerve." The bulb dimmed, shadows stretched. The faint rustle of paper sounded almost like laughter being careful not to break the air. The first thing he noticed the next morning was the smell. Fresh coffee and wet pavement, that earthy dew-it that always reminded him of waking early for school. The second thing was the sound of someone humming outside. A melody wove through the half-open kitchen window, soft off-key but familiar somehow. He pushed the curtain aside. Across the yard, the next house's porch light clicked off, revealing Mrs. Cortez sweeping petals from her step. Her movements had the precision of someone doing the same thing for years, automatic yet gentle, like she was brushing away the night itself. She had been their neighbor since before Morty could ride a bike. Rick used to call her the surveillance system, half affectionate, half paranoid. Morty hadn't seen her in nearly a decade, but she looked the same, gray hair tucked in a bun, big glasses magnifying brown eyes, apron dotted with flour even at sunrise. Some constant survived entropy. He walked outside, the screen door groaning the same complaint it always had. "Morning, Mrs. Cortez." She looked up, startled at first, then smiled wide. "Lord above, Morty Smith. I thought I saw a ghost coming out of that house yesterday. You're taller now. Still have your grandfather's slouch. Though, I guess posture's hereditary." Her laugh came out raspy but warm. "You been inside there alone, brave soul." They stood in the weak sun for a moment, silence filled by birds and the squeak of broom bristles. The air carried that metallic scent that comes after a heavy rain, the kind that makes every color pop sharper than you expect. "I've been cleaning," he said, trying to decide what to keep. "Keep the lessons, throw away the junk," she said without hesitation. "Men like your granddad always left equal portions of both." He couldn't help smiling. "You knew him pretty well." "Well enough," she said, leaning on the broom handle. "I came over every other Friday for coffee when my husband was still alive. Used to sit right over there." She nodded toward a chair beside her door, its paint faded to sea foam green. "Talked circles around my poor Thomas about the sky, time, all sorts of nonsense. But when he spoke about you kids, he got quiet. That's hard to imagine. It surprised me too." Her eyes softened. He'd look down at his mug and say, "That boy, he looks at people like they matter. Don't let the world talk him out of that." Then he'd finish his coffee and disappear before I could answer. Morty felt something catch in his throat. "He said that." Mrs. Cortez nodded, more than once. "Always ended the same way. I'm not sentimental," he'd claim, as if confessing a crime. But we both knew better. The porch screen clattered then, a cat darted past, tail whipping. She bent to scoop it up, muttering affectionate Spanish curses. Morty watched her stroke the animal's back, noticing how easily she slid back into life's small routines. Maybe that was what Rick had admired, contracts with everyday tasks, no matter how big eternity pretended to be. "I came across a box of his tapes," he said quietly. "Recordings. Some are personal. I'd expect nothing less." That man thought sound could outlive guilt. Morty chuckled despite himself. "You sound like you knew his tricks." "Oh, I heard enough of them," He helped fix my radio once, remember? Ended up making it pick up police scanners and airline chatter. My Thomas called him weird genius, which coming from a mechanic was almost a compliment. She brushed at her apron, then looked him square in the face. You look like him when you're thinking hard. Don't let it scare you. He leaned on the porch rail, inhaled the scent of jasmine twined through the fence. Sometimes I think I came out of his brain instead of his bloodline. Her expression softened further. No, my Hijo. You came from everyone he ever loved but didn't know how to keep. The simple truth of it sat between them for a while, the air too heavy for quick conversation. The cat purred. Wind rustled the magnolia leaves. Somewhere a truck shifted gears on the highway. When she finally spoke again, her voice was lighter. He left something with me once, said to keep it until someone came asking about him with eyes that didn't look angry anymore. Morty blinked. Something? Mrs. Cortez disappeared into her house. He waited, feeling that odd tremble that anticipation carries, like being watched by time itself. She returned holding a plain envelope, edges curled. You can open it if you want, she said, handing it to him. But don't read it just for facts. He never wrote straight lines, he wrote mazes. He thanked her, clutching the envelope as if it might fly away. Tell your mother I said hello, she called when he turned toward the fence. And if ghosts start tinkering in that basement again, bring them coffee first. Morty laughed, the sound of relief. You got it. Back inside, he set the envelope on the kitchen table next to the others. The handwriting matched. The same deliberate tilt, the same impatience disguised as control. He opened it carefully. Inside was a postcard from decades ago. The front showed a seaside cliff at sunset, waves frozen mid-crash. On the back, a single sentence. People think genius is loud, it read. But what saves you in the end is whoever sweeps their porch, same hour, same song, every day you're gone. He exhaled softly. The hum of the old fridge joined the clock's steady tick. Each ordinary sound felt elevated, sacred in a small-town way. He turned the postcard over once more, fingers pressing into the gloss until it warmed. Outside, Mrs. Cortez was humming again, sweeping the porch as if on cue. It occurred to him then that Rick's legacy wasn't trapped in machines or notebooks, but scattered among people who had witnessed him without judgment. The unnoticed constellations that steady a life. Morty taped the postcard to the fridge door. For the first time, the kitchen stopped feeling like a relic and started feeling like home in recovery. Evening eased slowly through the curtains. He found himself at the sink watching the neighbor put away her broom, wave once, then vanish inside. The habit loop complete, the routine faithful. He whispered almost to the air, "Thanks, Mrs. Cortez, for watching the stars next door." Upstairs the floor settled, a quiet punctuation. Somewhere, maybe, Rick was listening too, amused that the great mysteries of the universe were being solved by a porch, a broom, and a neighbor who didn't believe in endings. Afternoon light streamed through the kitchen window, spreading warm stripes across the table. Morty stood there, hands resting on the wood, watching dust dance like it was rehearsing for something grander. The house was stunningly ordinary today, no lingering ghosts of thought, no rain whispering warnings, just quiet. He decided that he wanted to know what quiet had sounded like for Rick, if such a thing had ever existed. There were still tapes he hadn't touched. One sitting on top of the stack was labeled simply "The Quiet Genius" in that tight, deliberate handwriting. He carried it down to the basement. The air was cooler there. A small underground climate unto itself. He slipped the cassette into the player and pressed the worn square of the play button. The first thing he heard wasn't a voice. It was ambient. The hum of fluorescent lights, the faint tick of tools settling on metal, a cough. Then Rick's voice, uncharacteristically hesitant. If brilliance is just remembering what others forget, then maybe stupidity is the mercy of being able to move on. I don't sleep much lately. Ideas talk too loud. Morty sat. He imagined his grandfather hunched over this same workbench, talking to the recorders in different ear, building confessions disguised as data logs. The description of sleeplessness didn't surprise him. Rick had lived like the night was a rival he could outthink. I used to think having answers made you safe. Turns out it just makes you responsible. Rick exhaled audible smoke. When you're a kid and you pick apart a toy, you think you'll understand it once it's in pieces. Then you end up with parts that used to mean something together. That's all genius really is. Getting good at breaking things and pretending that's progress. Morty felt something inside him shift, like a key that didn't fit suddenly finding the right angle. Rick had never let that kind of honesty live outside sarcasm. The recording stuttered slightly, then continued with background sound of pen scratching. I built machines to record patterns of thought. I wanted to catch the spark before it burned out. Maybe I was trying to bottle my better moods, store them somewhere you could find one day. I didn't label them nicely. Forgive that. I was still pretending I'd destroy them before you got curious. Morty leaned forward, elbows on knees. He tried to picture the version of Rick who made this tape, the one awake at 3 a.m., surrounded by half-assembled devices, convinced that memory could outsmart emotion. On the shelf opposite the workbench sat the broken microscope Rick once used to teach him about magnification. Genius, Rick had said back then, isn't seeing what others can't. It's refusing to stop staring until they do. Morty had laughed, thinking it was another quip. Hearing the tape now, the line glowed differently. Stripped of bravado, he paused the recording and looked up at the clock. 2:47 p.m. The basement smelled faintly of ozone and old coffee grounds. He realized this was his favorite version of time. Not morning promise, not evening fatigue, but that midpoint where everything breathes evenly between energy and rest. That rhythm, he thought, might be what Rick secretly envied in people who weren't geniuses. When he pressed play again, the tape crackled into a new section. Morty, if you ever hear this, remember, I never cared about being smartest. I cared about not being useless. Knowledge is a weapon, sure, but sometimes it's just noise. The real trick is learning when silence is smarter. Then, faint laughter, the dry, self-mocking kind Morty had missed. You won't believe this, but I tried meditation. Spoiler, didn't shut anything up. Brain treated it like an engineering problem. So I built a metronome that ticked at the frequency of my heartbeat. It didn't calm me, just reminded me the damn thing keeps going whether or not I fix the universe. A chuckle, then the shuffle of chair legs, a sigh too human for myth. There's a shelf in this basement. You should find it by accident one day. Behind the jars of screws, there's a box with small glass vials. They don't hold chemicals, they hold sound. Each one has 20 seconds of whatever piece I managed that year. Recorder I built compresses emotion into waveform. Yeah, I know, ridiculous. But if you listen, you'll hear it. Wind, breathing, sometimes laughter. The quiet genius captured in its natural habitat, almost silence. Morty's eyes flicked instinctively to the shelves opposite. Between two rusted jars, he could see the corner of a smaller box caked in dust. A chill climbed his arms. He didn't move yet. He let the recording continue. If they leaked, don't throw them away. Let them evaporate. Some things didn't survive me either. Click. End of side A. Morty sat motionless for a while. The fan above the furnace stirred the air into lazy swirls. Tiny trails of dust looped through the light and then settled again. He stood, crossed to the shelves, and lifted the box. Inside were indeed small vials, thin tubes plugged with cotton, each labeled in microscopic writing April 85 morning wind. Sept 89 stolen nap, June 2003 family noise, 2:10 p.m. He uncorked one. For a moment nothing happened. Then a sound, barely perceptible, seagulls and maybe laughter under them. A pause, then silence. Whatever technology Rick had cobbled together, it worked just long enough. Morty felt himself grinning through the sting of tears. The man had tried to bottle tranquility, and against all odds, he'd succeeded for a handful of seconds. He placed the vial back, heart beating slow and musical, in time with the hum of the basement. This, Morty realized, was Rick's real genius, the kind that existed beside the noise, not within it. The genius of noticing quiet things before they disappeared. He rewound the cassette and pressed play from the beginning one last time, letting the words fill every corner. Knowledge is a weapon. The real trick is learning when silence is smarter. The tape ended again, softer now, like its magnetic particles were tired from being awake too long. Upstairs, the day leaned into evening. Gold light faded to amber. He turned off the player. For a long while he just sat on the concrete, palms open on his thighs, breathing deliberately, and training himself to the rhythm of stillness Rick had tried so desperately, and failed, to patent. The realization felt weightless. Genius could indeed be quiet, but it rarely survived the ego it lived inside. Rick had left behind the proof, neatly labeled, behind jars of screws. Morty smiled to himself, whispering into the electric hush, "You were wrong about meditation, old man. It works if you stop trying to improve it." The bulb above flickered but held steady, humming faint praise. When he went upstairs, the house felt gentler than before, as though all its stored noise had found rhythm at last. He looked once more toward the basement door. Not fear now, not even grief. Just respect. Sometimes loving a genius meant learning how to listen when there was nothing left to say. He closed the door quietly behind him, the latch catching with that small, contented click of understanding. By morning, the clouds had blown east, leaving the sky sharp and colorless. The air smelled of asphalt and sugar. Some neighbor had already started baking before 8 a.m. Morty sat on the porch steps with a mug of instant coffee, the old ceramic one that still bore a faint burn mark from something Rick had once set on fire, for science. He had no plan for the day except one overdue visit. Every tape he'd listened to pulled him deeper into solitude, and somewhere under the static he could hear voices that weren't recorded. His mother, his sister, laughter from years ago when absence hadn't yet become tradition. He finished the last of the coffee, rinsed the mug, and locked the house. The walk to Beth's was short, only 6 blocks, yet felt like crossing eras. Familiar streets looked edited. New trees, repainted fences, the hardware store now a boutique selling soap wrapped like gifts. Even the air felt domesticated. He wondered what Rick would have said about that. Probably something about entropy gentrifying chaos. When Beth opened the door, she paused at first, as though she was seeing someone she'd only met in stories. "You look tired," she said finally. Then, concern softening the words, "Come in." The house smelled like lemon detergent and wet dog. It had always smelled exactly like home. Summer's old guitar leaned in the corner near the couch, a fact that made him smile. His mother poured him tea she didn't even have to ask he wanted. Childhood muscle memory. They sat opposite one another at the kitchen island, surrounded by quiet so steady it felt rehearsed. "So," she said, stirring her cup though she never took sugar, "cleaning up the old place." He nodded. "Yeah, sort of an archaeological dig. You find his things?" "Tapes, drawings, letters. A few inventions that never worked and a few that probably shouldn't." He tried to grin. Her eyes flicked down to the table, then back up. "I don't know whether you're brave or foolish for going through it." "Probably both," he said. "Depends on the day." They sat in companionable tension. Years of unspoken questions vibrated just under the small kitchen sounds, the hum of the fridge, the drip of condensation against glass. Finally she said, "You've always wanted to understand him more than you blamed him. You get that from me?" He laughed quietly. "You sure it's not the other way around? I could make a career out of blaming him and never run out of material." "But you didn't," she said, voice steady. "You came back." They both smiled, faint but real. Beth stood to refill her cup and, without turning, said, "He wrote us letters, you know. I could never open mine." Morty watched her shoulders rise and fall. He wanted to say sorry in a way that didn't make him admit he was. "Yes," she said, nodding. "That sounds exactly like him." The back door slid open then and Summer appeared, hair still half wet from a shower, phone in one hand. When she saw Morty, her face split into genuine surprise. "There he is, the basement goblin returns." She hugged him tight, smelling of coconut shampoo and dead lines. "Mom said you were sorting the wreckage. How's the archaeology?" "Emotional fossils mostly," he said. She grinned. "You find any treasure?" He took in her tone, teasing but also testing. He decided to give her one. From the pocket of his jacket he pulled the smallest glass vial from Rick's hidden box. He held it up. "This," he called it, a peace recording. Summer squinted at it. "Looks like a cough drop container." "Yeah, but listen." He uncorked the top. A fragile whisper leaked out, soft wind, a far-off gull cry, barely there but enough. Beth turned quickly, eyes wide. Summer froze. For a moment the kitchen filled with the impossible sound of their past made tangible. Then it faded, leaving only the tick of the wall clock. "What was that?" Summer whispered. "A small piece of him that wasn't angry," Morty said. They stood in silence longer than the sound had lasted, because silence suddenly meant something again. Summer was first to speak. "I miss the old jerk." "Yeah," Morty said gently. "You're allowed to." Beth leaned against the counter, blinking rapidly. "He drove me crazy, Morty. But she stopped, searching for the right word. "He did love us. He just never stayed put long enough for it to sound convincing." Morty gave a half smile. "He might have stayed longer than we realized. In little ways." Summer rolled her eyes, though not unkindly. "Listen to you sounding like a therapist. Occupational hazard of grief," he said. They spent hours talking. First about Rick, then about old neighbors, jobs, the cat that still showed up even though it wasn't theirs. The rhythm of conversation was awkward at first, then easier. Every laugh slipped out a little freer. As afternoon drifted toward evening, they carried their chairs onto the porch. The sun sank behind the trees, leaving streaks of copper and violet. Fireflies began to flicker near the hedges, as if the world were gently applauding their reunion. Beth turned to her son. "What are you going to do when you finish cleaning that house?" He shrugged. "Probably keep living in it for a while. Feels wrong to leave it empty. Besides, the ghosts pay a decent rent." She smiled, a proper one this time. "You're starting to sound like him." "God forbid," Summer said. "Maybe not so bad," Beth corrected. "Just add more kindness and less gasoline." They all laughed, the shared sound vibrating off porch railings and into twilight. When they finally said goodbye, night had settled. Morty promised to come back for Sunday dinner, an invitation accepted without conditions for the first time in years. Walking home, he felt lighter, not because the house had lost its ghosts, but because he realized ghosts were only memories that had found voices again. At the intersection near the hardware store, he stopped under a flickering streetlight. The quiet wrapped around him, thick and generous. For a moment he imagined Rick walking beside him, hands in lead coat pockets, muttering commentary about pedestrian signal timing. Morty chuckled to the air. "They remember you, you know. Even the neighbors." He could almost hear the dry responsey, "Good. Infamy beats obscurity." When he reached the house, he didn't go straight inside. He stood on the porch, gazing at the window where the glow of one old lamp made a square of light on the lawn. He could hear Beth's laughter echoing faintly in his head, Summer's teasing, Rick's sarcasm softened by hindsight. He whispered, "Family unplugged, still on the same frequency after all." Inside, he placed the glass vial back in its box and turned the cassette player off. For once, he didn't need to listen to a recording to feel connected. The silence itself was enough, humming like a low-voltage current through every room. He turned off the lights and let darkness settle in, not as absence but as calm. The house seemed to pulse with the hum of its own quiet genius. This time, the family's combined heartbeat instead of Rick's lone buzz. Outside, the stars multiplied until even the empty sky looked full. The dream came just before dawn. A table covered in blueprints flickered through half-light, smoke curling upward like sentences too soft to read. Rick sat there, scribbling furiously, muttering equations that ran off the page and straight into fire. Morty reached out to stop him, but the paper blazed brighter, and then he was awake. Heart pounding, smell of ash still miles behind his eyelids. When morning fully arrived, the dream refused to fade like dreams are supposed to. He carried it with him into the hallway, into the kitchen where another weak pour of coffee tried and failed to disguise nostalgia. The kitchen clock barely ticked now, its second hand catching every few beats. The air itself felt paused. Outside, the lawn winked with dew. He noticed how quiet the neighborhood was, just birds, a single car door, the faint early chatter of sprinklers. Everything normal except for the way his chest pulled him toward the basement like gravity. He followed. The basement greeted him with its usual shiver of temperature drop, the smell of grease and memory. His hand hesitated on the light chain, as if yanking it might wake whatever slept down here. The bulb obeyed reluctantly, stuttering to life, spilling warm circles across the concrete floor. Crumpled papers still scattered the bench from the night before, drawings half-studied, ideas left mid-gesture. He began straightening them, more for the comfort of motion than any real tidiness. When he slid aside an old tin box, he noticed something jammed between the workbench and wall. A blackened spiral notebook, edges curled like bark after a wildfire. Of the burned notebook, he lifted it carefully, flakes of ash falling onto his shoes. The cover had been melted just enough to blur the words. E-motor anti-arphacy testi. Opening it released the smell of scorched ink. A scent at once industrial and heartbreakingly human. Inside, several pages still survived, though half-charred corners brittle. The handwriting, Rick's usual all-caps precision, persisted through the damaged purpose, translate brainwave patterns into corresponding audio frequencies for emotion recognition. Why? Because nobody listens until you give them proof in decibels. Morty's breath caught quietly. He flipped further. Beneath sketches that looked half-technical, half-philosophical, another line appeared, circled heavily goal-changed. Emotion not measurable. Try documenting instead of converting. That handwriting break, the spiky T, was Rick's in frustration mode. At the bottom of that page, he'd written almost like a diary entry. Humans malfunction when unexpressed. If you trap a feeling long enough, it'll burn on exit. The irony of burn, in both ink and fate, was not lost on Morty. He remembered now, the faint smoky morning one summer when the lab alarm had tripped. Rick had brushed him off, saying something about thermal calibration failure. But Morty recalled the small scorch mark staining the driveway later. He must have thought nothing of it. It wasn't fire, it was confession gone wayward. He ran a finger down another page. The ink blotched into drowned constellations, words dissolving where water or sweat had touched, prototype too loud, heartbeat loop overwhelmed signal, need quieter medium, tape maybe, so this was before the tapes. The notebook was blueprint, the seed of all his acoustic inventions. The step right before regret turned into documentation. Morty smiled faintly. For a man so terrified of emotion, Rick had tried desperately to measure it, name it, preserve it like starlight in jars. Tucked at the back was a folded paper, less damaged. Different tone altogether, half drawing, half note. A doodle of Morty at age 12 holding what looked like a tape recorder. Beneath it, one sentence written in a scrawl that veered perilously close to genuine handwriting. If he ever finds this, maybe he'll forgive what I couldn't say out loud. Morty sat down slowly on the stool and read that line again until the letters blurred into each other. Forgive what I couldn't say out loud. He closed the notebook gently, resting both palms on its charred cover like pressing a wound that deserved tenderness, not healing. The edge of him wanted to cry, but he remembered Rick's own refusal to dramatize. So instead he muttered, "You really overcomplicated sorry, didn't you?" The basement kept its hush. He turned toward the shelves of tools, the jars, the glass vials that now felt less like experiments and more like confessions disguised as chemistry. Somewhere in the quiet he thought he heard a faint crackle, wood contracting, or an echo, sound and memory blurred so easily here. On impulse he carried the notebook upstairs. He set it on the kitchen counter and opened all the windows. Fresh air rolled in clear, revealing how thick the basement air had been. Sunlight struck across the blackened cover, catching flecks of gold where the plastic spiral had melted. He fetched a shallow glass dish, filled it halfway with water, and very gently laid the loose ashes that had fallen out from the notebook into it. They floated, swirled once, then stilled. "You're cool now?" he whispered, realizing the absurdity and not minding. He spent the rest of the day scanning surviving pages with his phone, each image a piece of a lost manual to understanding Rick. The act felt ceremonial, translating scrawls into permanence, ensuring the words survived one generation longer. Late afternoon found him on the porch, the burned notebook cooling beside him in the shade. He flipped to one page he hadn't noticed earlier. Across the top were two drawn columns: logic, a love. Under logic equations, short. Under love, blank space. At the bottom of the empty column, Rick had written, almost as a punchline, left for him to fill in. Morty laughed, a short, startled sound that turned quickly into quiet. "Yeah," he told the sky, "working on it." The magnolia tree shimmered as the breeze calmed through. From the neighbor's porch came faint humming. Mrs. Cortez, keeping rhythm with the day. He leaned back against the step, eyes half closed. The heat had softened into that amber hour when light stops traveling and just hovers. For the first time, he felt something close to peace without needing a tape to summon it. Rick had burned his notebook, trying to contain emotions. Morty decided the better method was simply keeping them in circulation, alive, unmeasured, safely imperfect, behind him. From somewhere in the kitchen, a draft lifted the corners of the notebook's last page. It fluttered once like a breathing thing, then settled still, a mechanical sigh of acceptance. Twilight crept in slow as forgiveness. Morty gathered the notebook into his hands and whispered, "You wrote in equations, Rick, but you meant in feelings. I get it now." He went inside, placed the notebook on the table beneath the postcard from Mrs. Cortez, and switched off the light. The room fell into gentle dusk, illumination provided solely by memory doing the work of electricity. Outside, the horizon throbbed with sunset embers. Burns that didn't destroy, just glowed. The clouds came early that day, collecting across the horizon like old debts waiting to be settled. By mid-afternoon, the sky dimmed into a bruised gray, and the air took on that warm metallic tang that meant thunder wasn't far. Morty closed the last window but left the kitchen one cracked open. He didn't mind rain. It sounded like honesty. He'd spent the morning cataloging the surviving pages from Rick's burned notebook. They lay across the dining table in careful order, each page a map of thought-turned confession. On one, Rick had written, "Acoustic regression record storms, analyze comfort levels." Morty smiled at his handwriting, the kind of experiment that was half scientific curiosity and half therapy disguised as data collection. And now, just hours later, the sky responded as if on cue. The first drops hit the roof softly, audience applause before the show began. By the time he switched on the small tape player, the rain had already found rhythm. One of the unplayed cassettes sat near the edge of the table. Label faded, just the single word "Ron." He slid it into the player, thumb hovering above play, uncertain whether to hear his own weather echoed from Rick's years or to let this storm remain as alone. He pressed the button anyway, the tape hissed. Then Rick's voice, raspier than usual, floated through the static. "It's coming down outside." "Good. Kind of rain that erases everything but sound. I left the windows open for the experiment, but maybe I just missed hearing the world without commentary." Water thrummed against metal, a low thunder tremor followed. Rick chuckled, an unfamiliar, almost delighted sound. "Tell you what, Morty, if you're hearing this someday, don't fix everything that leaks. Some drips need to happen. Keeps the house humble." Morty leaned back in his chair, smiling despite the lump in his throat. The rain grew louder, it filled the room like company. They say storms 'cause negative ions. Maybe that's why people breathe easier during them. Everyone gets temporarily reset. Maybe that's the closest thing I'll ever get to redemption that doesn't involve equations. Another rumble of thunder swallowed the end of his sentence. The atmosphere in the tape and the one outside seemed to sync. For an instant, Morty couldn't tell whether the lightning flashed in the present or the recording. Rick took a drag from something. Not a cigarette, not exactly. Then, anyway, if you were around, I'd tell you to stop watching screens every time it rains. Just listen. Let the noise wash the day off. Rain doesn't solve problems, it reminds you some things clean themselves. Morty laughed softly. The advice sounded painfully close to wisdom. He pressed pause and looked outside. Sheets of rain leaned sideways across the yard, silver veils blurring every edge. The magnolia tree swayed, shaking off blossoms like confetti. For a heartbeat, he swore he saw a figure under it. Rick, maybe coat flapping, trying to measure rainfall with an old jar. Imagination, nostalgia, or both, he unpaused. On the tape, the storm was heavier now. Each drop hit like shrapnel. Rick's tone changed. A slow drift from observation to memory. "We had one of these nights, remember? Power went out. We lit candles. Told ghost stories that weren't fictional. You laughed at a stupid science pun. I don't remember which, but I remember the laugh. That's what experiments never capture. The variables that matter. Morty's eyes stung. He could picture it. The flicker of candlelight across glass beakers, electricity humming powerless. The two of them laughing because for a handful of hours there was nothing left to invent. The tape skipped slightly. Rick's voice came back quieter, closer to the microphone. If this tape ever plays again, it means I didn't nail solitude after all. Good. Some failures deserve applause. Static swallowed him. A long pause followed. Maybe the tape's blank side. Maybe intentional silence. Morty sat listening anyway, because now the living storm outside carried on the performance. Lightning stitched through distant hills, thunder replying seconds later like another voice joining the conversation. The whole house throbbed gently from its echo. The light flickered in the kitchen and went out. Power down. He felt no panic, instead a calm acceptance settled. He found one of Rick's old lighters in a drawer and lit a stub of candle left over from winters past. The flame released a smell of wax and years. He left the cassette spinning in the powerless player. Its little wheels tried to move on inertia alone, turning slower, the tape breathing between rotations. Each click became a heartbeat pacing the rain. He thought about what rain meant to Rick. Purge, illusion of renewal, data about rhythm for Morty. It was proof that noise could be comfort, that chaos could keep time. He walked to the window, leaned his forehead against the cool glass. Streetlights blurred into long golden threads on the wet pavement. He could hear fragments of the world. The hiss of gutters overflowing, a car passing with its tires whispering in puddles, a somewhere dog making sure existence heard it. When thunder sounded close, he answered it in a whisper. Yeah, I'm listening. The storm went on for hours. He brewed tea by candlelight. Not because he needed warmth, but because he wanted a reason to stay awake with it. He thought about how many nights Rick must have sat through similar weather, waiting for the sky to quiet enough for thinking. Waiting for forgiveness shaped like lightning. By midnight the worst had passed, only drizzle now, polite, tired. The electricity flicked back with a sigh through the wires. The fridge rumbled to life, clocks blinked unsure. He pressed stop. The tape wheel slowed to stillness. Outside, a last streak of lightning lit the yard in pure white. A photograph exposure of everything unguarded his face in the window. The magnolia's dripping branches. The swing set that hadn't moved since childhood. The thunder that followed sounded not like anger but applause finally fading. He unplugged the player even though the lights were back on. Something about ending the storm felt appropriate. Rick's voice stayed alive enough in his head anyway. He left the unspooled cassette resting on the sill to dry. Tomorrow he'd relabel it, maybe call it Rain. Both versions. The night settled slow. He curled up on the couch under an old blanket that still smelled faintly of solder and coffee. Through the open window came the tail end of the drizzle. Gentle patters sensing with his pulse until both sounds became one. He let his eyes close around Rick's last words. Good. Some failures deserve applause. The room darkened fully, but the darkness felt earned, like the pause at the end of a long conversation rather than absence. Sunday arrived baked in late summer haze, the kind of heat that made quiet feel heavy. Morty couldn't remember the last time he had worn a proper shirt, but Beth had sounded proud and nervous when she called. Dinner at 7. Nothing fancy, just family. It wasn't a request, it was hope disguised as logistics. He spent the early afternoon straightening the kitchen, though no one would see it. Setting plates in order steadied him. Noise of ceramic against wood made the house sound lived in. Before leaving, he opened the trunk of tapes one more time. There were still dozens, but tonight wasn't about them. He closed the lid gently and whispered, "Rain check, Rick." By 7. He stood at Beth's front porch, the sight of her lawn throwing him into memory. She answered the door wearing an apron dusted with flour and the same expression she used to wear when hiding stress behind instructions. "You came on time," she noted with mock surprise. He smiled, trying to set a new record. Inside, the air smelled of rosemary and butter, and under it, the faint electrical hum of a home not haunted. Summer was there too, balancing a tray of glasses like she was calming a circus act. "Don't just stand there," she said. "I fought the blender for these margaritas. They deserve witnesses." Dinner began shyly. Someone's fork chimed against a plate. Someone laughed too quick. A dog barked outside as though giving them permission to start. They spoke first of safe things. Work, weather. The neighbor's absurd new fountain shaped like a dolphin. The conversation moved as carefully as people crossing a frozen river, testing each word before placing weight on it. Beth poured wine and finally said what everyone felt. "It's stupid how long it's been." Summer nodded. "We text about memes more often than we actually see each other." Grandpa would have mocked us endlessly. Morty gave a small laugh. He'd still have a flip phone just to prove a point. That line broke the formality. Lauder chased away tension, and suddenly the table was alive with motion. Hands passing salad, glasses clinking, crosstalk spilling across the small terrain of food and memory. So, Beth said to Morty between courses, "Have you decided what to do with the house?" "I'll keep it for now," he answered. Feels like the right kind of silence. Summer leaned her chin on her hand. "Does it still smell like motor oil and regret?" "Mostly lemon cleaner now," he said. "But yeah, it's impossible to scrub out some ghosts." Beth's face softened. "I love that smell." Said it smelled like invention. They were quiet for a moment, listening to the air conditioner hum. It was the sound of ordinary living. Something Rick had mislaid but never stopped wanting. Morty reached into his bag and placed one object on the table. The small glass vial labeled Family Noise Twinsy 10 p.m. He'd brought it because he couldn't bear to leave it alone. "What's that?" Summer asked, already guessing. He explained. One of his weird projects. He recorded bits of happiness. "I thought maybe we could let one play during dinner." Beth hesitated but then nodded. "Why not?" "He'd enjoy being dessert." He pulled the cork. A faint hiss escaped, followed by a handful of seconds so intimate it stilled everyone's laughter. Beth's younger, Summer's childish squeal, Rick's unmistakable half-snort of amusement. The sound ended almost instantly, leaving air thinner shimmering. Nobody spoke. Beth wiped at her eyes. "That's from the barbecue," she whispered. "He'd just dropped an entire platter." Summer smiled through the ache. He said gravity was a liar. They all laughed again, the kind of laughter that hurts in the healthiest way. Morty corked the vial. "Whisk that counts as grace." After coffee, they migrated to the porch. The sun had folded itself behind trees, leaving the sky bruised rose. Moths fluttered near the porch light. Their conversation wandered the way only family talk can, meandering, circling, interrupting itself with jokes that needed no context. Beth turned reflective. "It's strange hearing his name and not feeling mad anymore. Just grateful. He gave me a love of curiosity, even if he packaged it badly," she says after threatening to throw his notebooks into the compost one Thanksgiving. Summer teased. Beth chuckled. "I almost did. He wrote formulas on napkins like some people doodle hearts." Morty leaned back in his chair. "He wrote about us too. I found letters he never sent. He wanted to explain himself but never knew the right tense to do it in." Beth looked at him, alarmed but calm. "You read them." "I think he wanted me to. They weren't exactly private. They were waiting." Summer shivered lightly even in the warmth. Maybe everyone leaves behind drafts of conversations they never got to finish. The porch light flickered, moth wings brushing its glass like tiny errands. They listened to the night take shape, distant music from another block, leaves shifting, crickets starting their long chorus. Beth spoke softly. He would have hated this stillness. Morty grinned, maybe. Or maybe he would have finally relaxed enough to enjoy it. Inside, the clock struck 9. They didn't move to mark the hour. Time itself had started behaving differently. Summer sighed, satisfied. "Okay, not to ruin the mood, but who wants dessert? I made something experimental in his honor. Chili chocolate cake," Beth groaned. "So we're ending the night with heartburn and nostalgia." Morty laughed as the sisters disappeared into the kitchen bickering about frosting. He stayed outside a moment longer. Fireflies pulsed over the lawn, each one looked like a tiny, forgiving applause. He thought about Rick's tapes, the letters, the failed experiments in emotional translation. None of it fixed the years they'd lost, but maybe fixing wasn't the point. Maybe acknowledging was enough. Beth returned with plates, Summer trailing behind carrying candles. They ate by small flame, the trio wrapped in the smell of sugar and smoke. Morty found himself saying quietly, this is how he'd want to be remembered. Everyone arguing, laughing, the occasional mildly toxic invention on the table. Beth touched his shoulder. You got that right. They toasted, unscripted, overlapping human. When the evening unraveled into goodbyes, Beth insisted he take some leftovers. Food should travel, she said. So should forgiveness. On the walk home, the night air held the soft weight of humidity and satisfaction. The stars pushed through the lingering haze one by one. He carried the container under one arm, the small vial secure in his pocket. Halfway down the block, he looked back, the porch lights still on, 2 silhouettes waving. The ordinary miracle of family alive despite distance, despite ghosts. At home, he set the leftovers on the counter, uncorked the vial one more time, and listened to that captured moment of laughter again. It mixed with the hum of his refrigerator and the cricket song outside, merging decades into one homely present tense. When it faded, he said softly, "You were right, old man. Some drips need to happen." He turned off the lights. The darkness felt peaceful, not emptiness, but satisfied space where voices had finally learned to share silence. The town library still smelled like pencil shavings and patience. Even at night, light bled from its arched windows like a promise someone forgot to close. Morty hadn't stepped inside since high school, but some magnet of curiosity dragged him there after cleaning dishes, after the reunion laughter had faded into its echo. Outside, rain had left the pavement shiny, a mirror of street lamps and ghosts. He hesitated at the door, reading the taped sign that said Seelofter Tier PM. Vule you are smarwy. Beneath it, in smaller print, inside quiet as a shared invention. He smirked at that. Rick would have hated that rule. But the door wasn't locked. The hinges sighed politely as he pushed it open. The air was cool and dry, trapped decades circling in it. Single fluorescent bars hummed overhead. The place looked almost asleep. Rows of shelves yawning their infinite alphabet, the checkout desk cluttered with unclaimed bookmarks and receipts. From somewhere deep in the stacks came the slow shuffle of paper. A voice said, "We're closed, technically, but since you're already in." Morty froze. A figure stepped from between shelves, narrow, stooped, cardigan gray enough to be camouflage. The man carried a stack of periodicals and a face that looked like it had been folded gently by time. "Sorry," Morty began. "Door wasn't locked. Used to come here. Didn't mean to." The older man waved him silent. "You look familiar." Then his eyes brightened. "Smith." Your writ startled Morty, that instant recognition. "You knew him?" "Knew, yes." "Understood." "Debatable." The man set down his stack. "Arthur Poe. He once tried to rent our microfiche back in the 90s. Said he was researching cellular memory in cephalopods." Morty laughed. "That sounds about right." He spilled coffee on everything. Also fixed a slide projector no one else could fix. Cost mitigation by chaos. Arthur smiled. There was affection in it. "I came here often during the months your grandmother was sick. Sat in that corner near the biographies. Said he was looking up brain structures, but I think he needed somewhere that hummed quietly without judgment." Morty followed him down the aisle. The carpet underfoot softened every step, a hush that made listening easy. They stopped before a hidden nook with 2 wing-back chairs and a small reading lamp. "He used to sit right here," Arthur said. Wood muttered to himself, sometimes record notes on a little deck. Once he told me books are the slowest computers, yet somehow the most forgiving. Morty sat in the other chair. Forgiving. They let you rewrite them each time you open one. Memory doesn't. The line hung between them, delicate as the dust in the beam of light. Arthur studied him. "You've got his eyes, same curiosity. Less bitterness, I hope. I'm working on it. You find anything?" Morty hesitated. "A lot. Mostly questions pretending to be answers." The older man nodded slowly. "That's his legacy then. Teach people how to live within the question marks." They fell quiet for a while. The only sound was the clock above the circulation desk ticking with a lazy old dignity. Arthur rose. "Wet here." He disappeared into the darkness of the reference section and returned carrying a slim folder. "I kept this." He handed it over. "Thought your family might want it someday." Morty opened it carefully. Inside were photocopied journal pages, diagrams annotated in blue pen, Rick's unmistakable handwriting. At the top of the first page, memory decay study. Observations for Beth and Co. Arthur explained. He was researching degenerative memory disorders. Brought in data from the nursing home when I used to volunteer there. Would spend hours talking with patients. Not about science, about their gardens, radio shows, their grandkids. Morty looked up, caught off guard. "Hey, did that?" "Oh yes." Complained every minute, of course, but kept coming back. He said working on memory loss was his way of apologizing to his own. He even donated funds for this library's sound archive. That's how we could restore old vinyl collections. Morty leafed through the pages again. At the bottom of one, Rick had written, "When you help someone remember, you borrow clarity for both of you." The old librarian chuckled. See, even when pretending to be gruff, the man snuck philosophy between formulas. They talked a bit longer. About thunderstorms, about the way Rick used to hold pen caps in his teeth like cigarettes. Arthur brewed instant coffee in the staff lounge, insisting it was part of the nocturnal library experience. Did he ever mention us? Morty finally asked. "Often," Arthur said. "Pouring. Usually when complaining about himself. He adored you lot. Hated that he didn't speak fluent normal. Thought genius had broken his translation chip." Morty swallowed a smile. "I think we all knew that. He left something else too." Arthur rummaged through a drawer, produced an audio cassette sealed in a plastic sleeve. Label reading library test. Sound resonance. "What's on it?" Morty asked. "I never listened. Said it'd play when someone from his bloodline came looking, not before." "My hunch. Another experiment of the heart disguised as acoustics." He pressed it into Morty's palm. "If you do play it, do it here. Feels right." Morty nodded. They sat quietly, sipping. Around them, books leaned in to listen. He slipped the tape into the old player Arthur retrieved from behind the desk. The world ticked once before sound unfurled. A low hum like library air vibrating, then Rick's voice, faint and tender. "If intelligence is noise that tries to organize itself, then kindness is the silence that lets it rest. Thanks for keeping my seat warm." The tape ended there. Arthur nodded once, deeply. "Yep, that's him." Still stealing last words, Morty laughed softly. It felt less like irony and more like arrival. When he left, the librarian locked the door behind him and waved. Come by any time. Midnight's our best hour. Outside, the air tasted of rain and old paper sweet in its decay. He walked down the empty street holding the folder under his arm, still hearing Rick's voice folded inside that single sentence. At home, he placed the cassette on the mantel beside the burned notebook. Together they looked like punctuation, the kind that waits, not ends. He sat by the window until the first soft blue of morning stained the clouds, thinking that maybe wisdom wasn't louder or brighter than before. Maybe it was just finally ready to whisper. The night after his visit to the library, Morty dreamt vividly, the kind of dream that felt designed more than random. It began with light as slow, gold ripple rolling across clouds until it pooled around him. He stood barefoot on what looked like a floor made of old cassette tape ribbon, the spools unfolding endlessly in all directions. When he stepped forward, the ribbon whispered underfoot. Snippets of recorded words, louder wind silence. Each step played a fragment of memory. Somewhere ahead, someone was humming the tune Mrs. Cortez always hummed while sweeping. Then he saw Rick. Not young, not quite spectral, but formed in that in-between way dream logic permits. Lab coat loose, hair less white. He was sitting at a table scattered with tools that never rusted, tinkering with a device Morty recognized from no reality. Half recorder, half heartbeat. Well, look who finally showed up, Rick said without looking up. He sounded amused, not scornful. Took you long enough. Morty felt 11 again, nervous and eager to prove himself. Am I? Dreaming? Rick answered, tightening a bolt. Or remembering. Pick one. Doesn't matter. Morty walked closer. I've been listening to your tapes. Rick sighed. Yeah, I noticed the echo. You meant for me to, didn't you? Rick looked up then, and the face was tired but kind. Of course. You think I went through all that trouble just so dust mites could enjoy my monologues? Morty smiled despite the lump in his throat. You could have just talked to us, you know. For real. That's rich, Rick said softly. I couldn't even talk to myself for real until after I was gone. Some conversations require hindsight. They stood in comfortable silence. The surrounding floor of ribbon glimmered, looping fragments of their history. There was laughter, faint mewling of the family's old cat, the spark crackle of electrical experiments, and the solid clink of glasses from the reunion dinner, impossibly recorded in advance. Morty said, You recorded everything. Rick snorted. Nope, only the things worth turning into myths. The rest you had to live yourself. He gestured toward a nearby wall, or something shaped like one, covered in moving images, as if the tapes themselves projected their contents. Morty saw scenes himself at 10 helping tighten screws, Beth stirring soup while reading a manual, Summer making a volcano science project in the garage while Rick pretended not to be invested. He reached out, fingertips brushing the air, and the images rippled like water disturbed. You kept all this? Morty whispered. Rick shrugged. Had to. I forget existential stuff easily. Needed proof that things were real once. Morty swallowed hard. Then why the erasures, the mind blowers, the blanks? Rick's expression softened. Because human operating systems don't have unlimited storage, and because some mistakes echo too loud, I try to quiet them, kid. Turns out muting regret just makes it hum at a different frequency. Morty looked down. The ribbon at his feet had changed color, darker now, shimmering between black and violet. What's this place, really? He asked. Probability, Rick said, almost tender. It's where everything we almost do ends up. Dreams borrow from it. Libraries envy it. He reached for a nearby jar, a clone of the tiny vials Morty had discovered, and handed it over. Inside floated a soft glow, pulsing gently like fire caught in honey. What's in this one? Morty asked. Rick grinned crookedly. Your courage archived just in case you lose it again. Morty turned the jar in his hands. It emitted a hum that felt like heartbeats learning to sync. I don't know if I'm brave, he confessed. Sure you are, Rick said. You just confused reflection for hesitation. Common rookie mistake. They both laughed. Small, real laughs that made the air shimmer brighter. The horizon beyond Rick's table began to dissolve into faint lines, the signal of a dream nearing expiration. It's time, Rick said, standing. Around them, the world unspooled quickly, light falling away like film burning from the projector's heat. Here's the bit of wisdom no notebook ever caught. Forgiveness doesn't rewind anyone. It just stops you playing their mistakes on loop. Morty blinked back a tear. You could have told me that when you were alive, Rick smirked. Would you have listened? Maybe. Nah, some things need echo. The light around him fractured into fragments of stars. Rick began to fade, edges scattering into the dust of spent thoughts. Before the glow went entirely, he said one more thing. Keep the tapes, Morty. Not because they're me, but because they remind you that silence isn't empty. It's just loaded. And then the ribbon beneath Morty's feet dissolved. and he felt himself falling not downward but through remembering itself. He woke just before dawn, heart thudding steady, the faint hum of the refrigerator serving as his anchor to the real world. His palms tingled as though they had actually been holding glass. The house was still. On the kitchen table sat the cassette labeled Library Test. Sound Resonance, the one he'd brought home 2 nights ago. There, beside it, lay an unfamiliar vial glowing faintly, half full of soft golden light identical to the one from his dream. His breath caught. Maybe it was new, maybe he'd missed it before. He didn't touch it yet. Instead, he opened the window shutters. The first sunrise line skimmed across the countertops, turning each crumb, each mote of dust into glitter. The daybreak light hit the vial perfectly, scattering radiance around the room. Tiny reflections raced across the walls like starlight running late. Morty watched it shimmer for a long time and murmured, "Guess you kept your habit of being impossible, huh?" He laughed under his breath, a quiet, relieved sound. It echoed gently, and for the first time the echo didn't hurt. The clock struck 6. Somewhere far away, thunder muttered its low morning prayer, promising rain but not delivering it yet. Morty placed the glowing vial on the window ledge, where sunrise and memory could share custody. He brewed coffee and sat near it. He didn't write down the dream, he didn't need to. Dreams were meant to fade so they could keep visiting under new disguises. Still, just before the light turned white and ordinary, he whispered to the air, "Thanks for meeting me halfway." A shimmer flicked through the glass, the faintest pulse like acknowledgement. The day began quiet, and for once quiet felt full. All day Morty thought about the vial that now sat on his windowsill. It hadn't moved, but somehow it glowed differently depending on when he looked at it. Early morning, shy and pale. By afternoon, steady and gold. As evening came, faintly red like the last ember of a conversation. He told himself it was just light refraction, some optical quirk. But part of him, the honest part, believed Rick was still tinkering from wherever he was, still adjusting variables just to make a point. He spent the day doing tasks that didn't need doing. Reshelving books by mood rather than title. Cleaning the coffee machine twice, sweeping the porch even though the wind would undo it all. The thing he absolutely avoided was going down to the basement. Because there, in the trunk of relics, waited the unplayed tape. It had no label, no handwriting, no numbering system, no hints. Just a cassette wrapped once with a string of red thread. From the start it felt different, less an artifact, more a dare. Rick had cataloged everything in impulsive detail. To leave this one bare was intentional. It was the scientist's version of leaving a locked box in a hallway full of open drawers, knowing curiosity would gnaw the hinges sooner or later. By dusk, Morty gave up pretending disinterest. He grabbed a sweater and padded down the basement stairs, half expecting the air there to feel changed. It didn't. It was the same chilled smell of time, dust, electricity. Only the light bulb resisted, flickering like it somehow disapproved of what he was about to do. He sat on the stool, the cassette in front of him. "All right, old man," he said softly. "What's the punchline?" He untied the thread, placed the tape into the player, and pressed play. Nothing happened. No hiss, no static, just the small mechanical hum of the motor turning empty. He adjusted the volume, checked the reel, spinning fine. The silence continued thick, aware. He let it play. A minute passed, then 2. The stillness became so audible it transformed into a sound of its own. There was something inside that quiet, layers of it. The distinct illusion that if he listened hard enough, he could hear the effort Rick had spent not recording anything. Then, faintly, like an old building settling a breath. Morty flinched, the tape had exhaled. Another breath, slower. Then a creak, maybe a chair. And finally Rick's voice, barely more than a whisper. "If you got this far, you already know more than I ever planned to tell. This one's blank on purpose. Don't rewind it. Don't look for a hidden track. The emptiness is the point." A pause filled the room until it felt like gravity itself was holding its breath. "I erased it myself. Hundreds of times, actually. I recorded, deleted, recorded again, until the tape wore thin. What you're hearing now isn't my voice. It's the residue. The parts of sound magnetic tape can't quite forget. Every recording medium remembers ghosts." Morty sat frozen, pulse matching the faint rhythm of Rick's words. "We spend our lives talking because silence sounds too much like truth, but sometimes the only honest data you can leave behind is absence. So here it is. Unplayed, practically unplayable. Whatever you need it to be. An apology, an experiment. A quiet goodbye." The voice cracked on goodbye, though whether from distortion or emotion Morty couldn't tell. The pause afterward stretched long enough for Morty to wonder if the tape had finally ended. Then, soft as wind, "You should probably stop here. Some knowledge doesn't expand. It just loops. If you listen again, make sure it's to yourself." Click. The cassette stopped, the reel slowed to stillness. Morty breathed out only then, realizing he'd been holding air too long. In that moment, the basement felt alive. The bulb steadier, the old pipes humming a faint metallic harmony. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice, then quieted as if on cue. He didn't rewind. Instead, he ejected the tape and set it on the bench, string beside it like shed skin. He stared at it, thinking of the deliberate nothing that Rick had left, how much intention hid in the restraint of not filling the silence. Upstairs, rain restarted, thin, sporadic drops tapping on the windows. He climbed halfway before looking back, one foot still on the stairs. The slightly glowing vial upstairs called faintly through memory, and he imagined Rick somewhere between the hum of the fridge and the whispering rain. Half amused, half proud, Morty went back to the workbench and opened the trunk again. His eyes ran over the dozens of labeled cassettes, voices, tests, confessions, but he found he didn't want to play another. The mystery felt complete, at least for tonight. Rick's final tape had handed him permission to stop searching. He placed the unplayed cassette back in its center, closed the lid, and sat beside it, listening to the rain build steady, as though the world was recording its own gentle track to match. A stray memory surfaced, Rick's gruff voice from some distant summer, telling him that every machine has a hum and people are no different. The trick, he'd said, is to notice when it's humming content instead of interference. Morty leaned his head back against the cold wall and smiled. His body hummed now, too, not excitement, not grief, just the odd equilibrium of comprehension. After an hour, he went upstairs. The vial on the windowsill still pulsed quietly, its glow matching the pattern of the raindrops running down the glass. He sat opposite it, knees pulled to his chest, and whispered, "You erased yourself to prove you existed. That's so you." His reflection ghosted in the window. His face doubled with the night sky beyond. For a heartbeat, that mirror held two figures, and then one. He lay down on the couch. The refrigerator clicked off, the rhythm of the house slowed, and for the first time, Morty didn't need background noise to fall asleep. The silence around him was proof of presence, not emptiness, an echo without a source, a song that kept playing after the needle lifted, and downstairs, without the touch of any hand, the tape deck light timed out and turned itself off, leaving the basement in perfect darkness, not loneliness, but rest. The weather cleared 2 days later, the way the world sometimes decides to start over without asking permission. The air smelled of wet earth baking into steam, a clean, faint sweetness after a long undoing. Morty woke early before the heat had taken hold, pulled on an old hoodie that still smelled faintly of solder, and found himself following muscle memory more than plan. The lake sat 12 miles up the rural road that cut through the edge of town. For years they'd called it the lab's vacation home, though it was just a wide patch of water surrounded by pines and the ghost of an old boathouse. Rick used to drive them there during summers when every sentence between family members was one word too close to argument. He'd claim it was for seasonal research, but once they arrived he rarely took samples. He'd just sit cross-legged with a thermos, staring at the reflection of the sky as if trying to reverse engineer serenity. Morty packed a lunch, grabbed the portable cassette player, and slung Rick's old messenger bag across his shoulder. Inside were 3 tapes and the unplayed one wrapped in its thread again for good measure, a gesture of respect rather than temptation. The drive took less time than memory promised. Sometimes distance is mostly nostalgia hiding from completion. By mid-morning, the lake appeared through trees, larger than he remembered, still as ever. The surface mirrored the clouds so faithfully that, for a moment, Morty couldn't tell where water ended and air began. He parked by the cracked path, the car's cooling engine ticking like a metronome of transition. The path curved downward through pine needles, leading to the small dock, still clinging to its rusted chains. One plank gave a warning creak under his step, the same note as 20 years ago. The lake answered with small ripples. He sat there, legs dangling over the edge, and let the silence stretch out until it joined heartbeat and breath into one continuous sound. Out here, quiet wasn't absence. It was presence magnified. He set the player beside him, inserted a tape labeled Field Recording 2 Resonance and pressed play. At first, wind-high whistling tones like microscopic bells. Then Rick's voice, younger, carried by the same wind that slipped over this very stretch of water. If this environment seems perfect for meditation, don't be fooled. Nature's indifferent. That's what's beautiful about it. Every ripple is an equation that doesn't care who solves it. That freedom is worth studying. Morty smiled. The words weren't hopeful but left peace in their wake anyway. Whenever the world gets too loud, you come here, Rick continued. Lake water, ideal for acoustic reflection. Sit, speak low. Listen long, you'll hear yourself clearer than you'd like. The tape faded into soft ambient water. Maybe I'm pouring something, maybe experiment residue. A dragonfly darted near Morty's shoe, its wings catching sunlight like stained glass. He thought about the afternoons he used to sit right here while Rick scribbled formulas on napkins damp with condensation. Morty had traced shapes into the dirt, pretending to design his own inventions, a machine that could store laughter, Another that could replay kindness exactly how it happened. He took out the letter envelopes he'd kept folded in his bag. He hadn't wanted them to yellow further. The one addressed to no one, the one containing the barbecue photo, still haunted him most. He flipped it over. On the back, Rick's faint pencil note, proof things worked once. He set it on the dock beside him where sunlight could bleach, not burn the fragile paper. Another loud sound broke the pattern. A single car engine somewhere on the far side of the lake, tires crunching over gravel, then silence again. Morty realized how rare full silence is. Even thinking makes noise inside the skull. Rick would have measured it. For hours he stayed, occasionally rewinding the tape and letting it fill the warm air with its patient hiss. Once he spoke aloud, not expecting answer. I get it now, Rick. You weren't hiding from the family. You were trying to put the universe on mute long enough to recharge. A gust of wind responded, sharp and cooling. He laughed under his breath at the coincidence. By late afternoon, the light shifted. Shadows of trees stretched long fingers across the lake, the color changing from blue to molten bronze. Memories began to arrive uninvited the first time they'd paddled out too far. Summer screaming with delight, Rick pretending annoyance but smiling so wide Morty could see it from shore. The image replayed neat as any recording. He reached into the bag for a clean cassette, one with no label, and pressed record. The machine's red light blinked alive. He spoke into the mic. Lake test, 2024. For whoever finds this or no one. Conditions calm. Subject quiet acceptance. He paused, listened to himself breathing. Notes he was right. Nature doesn't care. But maybe that's mercy. Because when nothing's judging, you can actually feel everything. Wind filled the tape with whispers. He let it run until the spools reached their end, capturing nothing and everything. He replaced it with something heavier in tone. The unplayed tape. He didn't plan to use it. Just look at it under daylight. Its black shell mirrored the sky like liquid glass. In that reflection he saw his own face, steady, unshocked, its angles simpler than he expected. The string fluttered once in the breeze before resting again. He slipped it back inside the bag. Enough ghosts had spoken for one trip. He spread lunch. The remnants of the reunion cake, now slightly melted, and a sandwich Beth had insisted he take. He ate slowly, letting the food's ordinariness ground the surreal edge of the day. When the sun tilted behind clouds again, drizzle began, light but certain. Each drop broke the water surface into tiny bursts of silver. The lake thickened with light and sound, every splash a syllable. Morty closed his eyes. The rhythm was hypnotic. He must have dozed. When he woke, twilight had turned the world indigo. Clouds parted, showing a strip of stars mirrored below. The perfect symmetry startled him awake. It looked endless, a portal made of patience. For a fleeting second, he imagined Rick stepping out of the reflection, hands in coat pockets, smirking. Told you infinities both ways. He whispered. Yeah, I see it now. The speaker hissed weakly, the battery giving out. He didn't replace it. Let failure be final this once, he packed. Left the notebook photo and one unlabeled tape on the dock as tribute. The lake didn't need those things, but he wanted them to belong to the same stillness Rick had studied. Driving back, fog rose off the asphalt in slow spirals. Each twist looked like breath. The entire road was a ghost recorder. By the time he reached the house, the fridge hum welcomed him like usual. He placed the cassette labeled Lake Test, 2024 next to the unplayed one. Two halves of one idea, expression and restraint, voice and void. He stood there until dawn's first faint light shimmered through blinds. Wes, that's balance, he whispered, then finally went upstairs. Sleep came easy, deep as the lake, and outside, far beyond hearing, water absorbed every echo the world decided not to keep. The day after the lake felt like the pause between breaths. The house perfectly balanced on that invisible line where motion rests just before continuing. Even the fridge hum seemed muted, cautious not to disturb whatever piece had been installed overnight. Morty woke later than usual, sunlight already strong against the curtains, and for the first time in weeks, the first thought that entered his head wasn't about the tapes. It was about breakfast. The normality of that startled him. He fried an egg, burnt the edges, and laughed out loud at how ordinary imperfection could sound. The sizzle, the scrape of the spatula, all of it music he hadn't known he'd missed. Rick would have insisted on quantifying the rhythm, plotting sizzling frequencies on a graph. Morty decided to let it be a song without a chart. After eating, he carried his plate to the sink and caught sight of the table by the window. The two cassettes from the day before, the one labeled Lake Test 2024 and the infamous unplayed reel, lay side by side like twin lungs. Between them sat the glowing vial, its light softer now, fading toward transparency. Morty approached carefully, half afraid touching anything might break the spell. He didn't touch. He just stood there watching the golden liquid pulse in slow sync with the light outside. He whispered, "You're running out, huh?" The glow steadied as if acknowledging. It didn't need to last forever, nothing that matters ever truly does. He thought about Rick's last entry from the unplayed tape. Don't replay it, listen to yourself instead. The words had been following him everywhere, into dreams, meals, even silence. Maybe today was about doing exactly that. He took the recorder from the counter and pressed record without loading any cassette. The device's red light blinked in confusion. It captured only ambient rhythm. The hush of walls, the distant highway, a door hinge sighing in another room. Morty sat beside it, listening. The longer he sat, the richer the quiet became. There were layers to it. The faint buzz of electricity feeding the bulb lines, the whisper of his own sleeve brushing against the chair, even his pulse clicking gently inside his ear, like a metronome belonging to some patient composer. This was the sound Rick had been chasing for decades. The music of existing without explanation. He let the imaginary tape roll for an hour. When he finally pressed stop, a calm he hadn't known possible settled over him. Afternoon light moved lazily across the floor. He followed it into the living room, where he unfolded the burned notebook and flipped through its surviving pages. Some of the drawings looked like mechanical nonsense. Others looked suspiciously like maps of constellations. In the margin of one, a note he'd missed before: silence isn't opposed to sound. It's where sound rests when it remembers what it is. He stared at the sentence until it memorized itself into him. He turned the notebook over, using the blank back cover as paper. In block letters, he wrote his own addition beneath it and people. He set it on the mantel above the fireplace. A simple altar of ink and forgiveness. Evening arrived without any official announcement. The air thickened, gold turned to blue. The first star blinked awake. Morty didn't turn on lights. He preferred to let darkness earn its way in. From outside came the neighbor kid's skateboard rolling once down pavement, a single car door closing, a millisecond of laughter before someone shouted for dinner. Those human sounds found their way through the thin windows, blending into the room's hush until everything was in delicate equilibrium. Morty leaned back on the couch. He didn't plan to fall asleep, but stillness is gravity. His eyes slipped closed. He dreamed. Not wildly as before, just a steady flow of images, the lake glowing under starlight, Beth's face lit by candle at the reunion dinner, Mrs. Cortez sweeping her porch. And over it all, Rick's voice, not speaking, not explaining, just humming. The hum grew fainter but somehow closer, like the bloodstream sound you hear after diving underwater. When he woke, night had deepened. The glowing vial on the table was almost empty now, only a sliver of gold trembled at the bottom like sunset caught in glass. Morty felt no sorrow at its dimming. As it faded, the walls of the house seemed to exhale, releasing their last measure of tension. He walked to the window and opened it wide. Cool air poured in, carrying the smell of wet dirt and pine from last night's rain. Every sense sharpened. Lights from neighboring houses dotted the street like gentle coordinates, proving that life continued next door as much as within him. He leaned on the sill. The wind touched his hair in light gusts, almost like a hand, almost like acceptance. Behind him, the cassette player gave a small mechanical click. He turned. The power light had switched itself off, though he hadn't touched it since morning. The timing was perfect. He whispered, "Thanks for teaching me how to stop talking." The room stayed quiet, but seemed to glow anyway. Not physical light, something else. Something weightless that filled the spaces between objects. He sat back down, gaze drifting over the notebooks, tapes, letters. None of them held power anymore. They didn't need to. They were no longer puzzles. They were pages of a story that had finally learned how to rest. When the last trace of gold from the vial disappeared, the absence didn't feel like loss. It felt like balance achieved. Morty picked up his pen, opened the notebook one last time, and at the bottom of a blank page wrote day, unnumbered. Experiment conclusion: when sound becomes stillness, it stops needing proof. He closed the cover gently, leaned back and listened. Outside, crickets had resumed their tiny orchestra. Inside, the only audible thing was his own breathing, a metered rhythm joining theirs perfectly. Somewhere far beyond or deep within, a half-imagined voice said, "You did fine, kid." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Morty smiled. "You too." The clock ticked once, acknowledging. Night folded softly around the room until quiet and darkness were the same texture. He stayed awake only long enough to feel that invisible threshold between hearing and being heard. Then, contentment took its turn. Morning came in the gentlest possible way. Slanted light sneaking through the blinds, golden dust that looked more like memory than matter. For the first time, Morty didn't wake with that low electric hum under his ribs. No anticipation, no dread. Just a steady calm that felt earned. He knew what the day required before his feet even hit the floor. It was time to start packing up Rick's house. He walked room to room, coffee cup in hand, taking inventory of this peculiar museum of intellect and chaos. Each wall carried echoes, but those echoes no longer hurt. They simply existed, like radio noise from a station that had finished broadcasting long ago. The kitchen held its usual evidence of genius disguised as clutter. Beakers turned into flower vases, a toaster that doubled as a radiation detector, and a half-written recipe for quantum pancakes. He laughed out loud reading that one. Only you could mix breakfast with particle theory. He folded the paper neatly instead of tossing it. Some absurdities deserved respect. In the living room, he found the couch permanently indented by late-night experiments and naps that pretended to be breakthroughs. Between two cushions lay a nut and bolt that clearly had no partnership, yet Rick had kept them there. Morty put them in a small box labeled Mies. Lo of Ranum Hagius. Upstairs was trickier. His grandfather's bedroom had never felt lived in, just functional. The bed stood made but rumpled, nightstand buried under half-assembled gadgets. On the wall above hung a chalkboard dense with equations curling like vines across the surface. In one corner he noticed handwriting different from the rest, a childish scrawl in pastel chalk. Morty YSUMCTM? He remembered that. The afternoon he was 8, when Beth had told them both to do something educational instead of loud. Rick had handed him chalk and said, "Go ahead, start the formula." For years that equation had survived every cleaning spree. Now some strokes had faded, but it remained legible enough to outlast either of them. Morty touched the corner and whispered, "You kept it." He hesitated, then took a photograph, not to hoard, but to preserve the balance between memory and release. After snapping it, he erased the plus sign and drew a small infinity symbol in its place. Then he stepped back, satisfaction quiet and complete, the way freshly closed books look satisfied to rest. The rest of the work took hours. He boxed books alphabetically, those few that weren't soaked in oil or annotated into madness. He labeled one carton T-Ries Tob Revesed in T-Ness, another Failed B Hansum Incremenents. He sorted screws into jars, found 3 packs of gum that could legally apply for citizenship, and uncovered an envelope of photos he'd never seen. Rick at 20 staring directly into a telescope, Beth standing beside him, arms crossed but smiling, and one blurry image of a workshop so bright it looked celestial. He gathered everything onto the dining table until it resembled the kind of chaos Rick would have probably approved of. Dense, promising, alive. The last thing left was the trunk of tapes. Morty sat cross-legged on the floor before it. One by one he lifted them out, nestling each into a carton padded with soft cloth. Every label held a heartbeat: mine, Blauer's AC Rain, The Quiet Genius Family Unplugged. When the trunk was empty, he ran a hand across its base. There, carved faintly into the wood beneath all those years of dust, was an engraving he'd somehow missed until now. Riarntio Qied after USE subtle Rick, he murmured, smiling, real subtle. He left the trunk open, exposed to air. Maybe it had earned a little light. Outside the window, a soft breeze moved through the magnolia tree, shaking loose a few petals. They fell like snow into the yard, landing on the patch where Rick used to sit with his half-broken telescope pointed at the same 3 stars every night. Somewhere in another box, Morty had labeled the telescope Stubur Hopi. By late afternoon the house looked bare but warm, like someone had finally finished a long, beautiful draft. He wiped the countertops, polished the workbench once, and stood in the doorway surveying everything. It struck him how little remained, yet how full it all felt. Before locking up, he made tea and drank it on the porch with the door wide open. Air carried in sawdust, the scent of tools cooling. Across the street, Mrs. Cortez waved from her step. She didn't speak, just lifted her broom in salute. He returned the gesture with his mug. Words were unnecessary, they'd both graduated from them. As dusk approached, he went back inside for one last check. The glow from the window had turned gentle amber. Each room wore the same expression, quiet awe. He turned off the lights in sequence: kitchen, living room, hallway. Each switch gave a small click, a punctuation at the end of a long paragraph. In the workshop he paused over the broken fan, the one that used to mark time with creak, creak, pause, rattle. It looked inert, but curiosity tugged him. He gave the blade a nudge. It spun one last slow revolution, sighed, and stopped directly facing him. "That's enough," he said aloud. He unplugged the lamp and stepped toward the stairs. The walls glowed faintly from lingering sunset, no artificial source needed. The house was illuminated by its own memory now. At the door he placed a hand on the frame, feeling the grain beneath his fingers. "You can rest," he said, unsure if he meant the building or the man who'd filled it, or himself. Locking the door was heavy work, but when he stepped onto the porch and turned the key, the sound was satisfying, final but soft. Closure redesigned as gratitude. He walked down the path to his car, boxes stacked neatly beside the trunk ready for tomorrow's trip to storage. On impulse, he looked back once more. Through the front window, the reflection of the magnolia folded perfectly over the empty living room. It looked like roots and branches embracing emptiness. Morty smiled and whispered, "Good lab. Old house." Then he slid into the car and sat there without starting the engine, watching as the remaining light receded from the roof tiles. The setting sun turned the glass to faint rose and then to darkness. In that pause before headlights in motion, he realized the strangest thing of all: silence no longer felt like waiting. It felt like being heard. He pulled out of the driveway slow, the tires crunching gravel, each sound precise, deliberate, belonging entirely to now. Behind him the house kept its promise, returning itself to quiet after use. Even after the car had taken the last turn out of the neighborhood, Morty could feel the house fading behind him, not disappearing, just rearranging itself into memory. By the time he reached his apartment, a light autumn wind had risen. It followed him up the stairs, tugging at his jacket as if reminding him, not everything left behind stays gone. He dropped the last box near his desk and stood staring at it for a while, hesitant to reopen anything. Inside were the envelopes, the recordings, the snapshot of the chalkboard, and the small reed-threaded tape. The modest museum of an entire family's unfinished sentences. He made tea first, the kind Beth used to brew when storms pretended to be important. Chamomile and honey, a mixture that calmed the air around it. Steam blurred his reflection in the window. Beyond the glass, city lights blinked through distant fog. Half the buildings looked asleep, the other half dreaming of work. He pulled a notebook toward him, the same one he had started in the silence chapter, now half filled. On a new page he wrote the date, then paused. Letters forward, he titled it. The phrase felt like a small, decisive breath after a long exhale. The first letter began simply, "To whatever comes next. If you're reading this, you're probably carrying at least one secret that doesn't deserve the weight you give it. I did too. It gets lighter once you speak it, or at least write it where paper can listen without arguing." He stopped there, uncertain if he wanted this to be a note to the future, to Rick, or to himself. Maybe all three. He kept writing anyway. The pen moved easily now, tracing reflections more than regrets. He wrote about the moments that didn't fit on tapes. Beth's shaky laughter during the reunion dinner, Summer's sarcastic blessing, Mrs. Cortez's humming drifting across fences. He described the lake at dusk, how water mirrors couldn't lie even when they wanted to. Rick taught me curiosity, he wrote next. Mom taught me endurance. Together they invented wonder and called it childhood. The rest was homework life gave me for free. He sipped his tea, reread the sentences, and smiled. Outside, wind nudged a loose cable against the balcony railing. Soft, rhythmic percussion. The city's own lullaby. He pulled another sheet of paper and, without hesitation, addressed it. To future kids of mine, see if any. You'll hear jokes about your great-grandfather, that he was reckless, genius, impossible. They'll all be true, but incomplete. What mattered wasn't how he broke things, but how he never gave up trying to rebuild after breaking them. Curiosity kept him human when arrogance tried to make him something else. If you find his tapes, listen to one, listen to none. Either way, promise me you'll record your own voice now and then, to remember how it sounds when you still believe in what you haven't proven. Belief is how memory rehearses courage. He signed the page simply, Morty. No last name. Legacies didn't need surnames when sincerity filled them. He folded both letters carefully. The paper still held the faint scent of tea. He slid them into fresh envelopes, unaddressed, just dated. He placed them beside the tiny red threaded tape on his desk. Midnight neared. The city quieted into that in-between hour when even electricity sounds half asleep. He turned off the lamp, letting only skyline reflections illuminate the room. He sat by the open window, knees drawn to his chest, a soft breeze calming through the faint clutter that already felt like comfort. He imagined Rick sitting across from him, elbows on knees, pretending not to care about sentiment. "Write faster, kid," the imaginary Rick said, "Entropy's charging rent." Morty chuckled. "You already prepared a few lifetimes. Just don't get poetic." The phantom warned. He rolled his eyes. Too late. The invisible presence grumbled, approval pretending to be irritation, and faded into the background hum of the transformers outside. He turned back to his notebook and added one final piece. Written more for sound than clarity, legacy is less about what we invent and more about what refuses to disappear after we stop narrating. If I vanish, may my silences keep their own small lights on. When he closed the cover, a streetlight flickered in brief applause. Maybe coincidence, maybe ghost humor. Both sounded fine to him. He spent the next few hours sorting the files on his laptop, labeling the scans of the pages he'd rescued. Each folder bore titles that looked more like feelings than topics: quiet, genius, rain, lake family. He knew he'd never publish them, but ordering them felt like setting constellations on an electronic sky. It was a way to keep access to I. Around 3 a.m., he sealed the 2 new letters inside a cardboard box with the rest, taped it shut, and wrote across the top in big marker strokes. Far some to wine. Opar uchoji start to make sense. He sat watching that box as if it might start breathing. The steady wind outside rustled against the glass. In it he swore he heard a familiar rhythm, the workshop fan's dying creak now reincarnated as city wind. It sounded not like ending but continuation. Before sleeping, he recorded one last voice memo on his phone, digital successor to magnetic tape. End of the notes, not the end of the noise. If anyone ever finds this, Know that Rick Sanchez was a scientist who taught the universe what stubbornness looks like, and that we, the leftovers, taught ourselves tenderness in response. He stopped the recording and played the last second back. His own voice came softer than he expected, almost calm. He placed the phone face down on the desk. The blue recording light shimmered through the metal briefly, then went dark, like a star completing its purpose. Outside, fog began to roll across the streets, absorbing the edges of things, making everything equal in tone and distance. Somewhere out there, maybe the magnolia tree at the old house was shaking new blossoms loose into the world, proof of continuity that didn't require witnesses. Morty lay down on the couch, using his jacket as a blanket. He let the city breathe around him, the quiet folded neatly under its own weight. Before drifting to sleep, he muttered to no one specific, "The letters are forward. The rest will follow." The wind answered with a sigh that sounded suspiciously like approval, maybe even applause under its breath. Evening turned up, dressed as autumn. The air sharpened enough to taste. Wood smoke drifted from somewhere down the street, carrying that instinctive promise that warm things waited inside. Morty came home from work with his hands deep in pockets, and the day folded neatly behind him like a page turned. This was it, the last chapter he hadn't meant to write but had somehow been living toward all along. The apartment was mostly unpacked now. On the desk sat the box marked for Samadawai. Opian Twigi start Tom Makey Senes. The urge to check it, just once, rose and fell like the first swell in a calm sea. He brewed coffee instead. The smell filled the room. Routine, not nostalgia, was the new magic trick. He carried the mug to the balcony where the wind teased at his sleeves. Beneath him, street lamps winked to life one after another, a slow spreading net of quiet intention. Lights have always known more about goodbye than people do. They fade without ceremony, trusting the next evening to turn them on again. On the little side table beside the chair waited Rick's portable tape player, kept more as a monument than a machine. He hadn't used it since the lake, but today felt right. He unwrapped the red thread from the unplayed cassette and slid it in. The button gave that familiar click, but the reel stayed still, battery dead. He laughed under his breath. Figures. Instead, he let the silence spin in imaginary circles. The hum of the city filled the gap, a bus sighing at a stop. Footsteps from a block away, the low arithmetic of crickets. The soundtrack of a world that had found its own way to keep time. He thought of the library at midnight, the lake's mirrored sky, Miss Cortez humming while the broom traced its endless loop. Each memory unfolded without ache. Film reels restored, free of static. What used to crowd him now simply accompanied him. He closed his eyes a moment. Somewhere, maybe, Rick was elbow deep in another universe's version of this night, tinkering with stars, testing gravity out of sheer restlessness. Morty liked the idea. It made the sky feel collaborative. The porch light above the balcony had been burned out for weeks. He fetched a new bulb from the drawer, screwed it in until it caught. For a second nothing, then a flicker, then warm bloom. The glow touched the railing, pooled on the concrete floor, softened the air with honey-colored calm. He let the door stay open. Light and cool breeze shared the threshold without conflict. That balance felt symbolic enough. On impulse, he pulled the Lake Test 2024 tape from his bag and clicked play. The recording began with a sharp hiss, then his own younger voice. Subject, quiet acceptance. Wind answered in the background, bringing the sound of water lapping against wood. He listened all the way through, past the hiss, until the reel clicked at its end. Then he pressed record over it, speaking softly. Not for posterity, not for proof, just for continuity. Final test, set in home. Subject, late piece. Observation, silence survived the scientist. So did the student. Conclusion, we were never trying to escape noise. We were teaching each other how to listen. He let the tape run another 30 seconds to capture the room's heartbeat, the constant pulse of existence around him. Before pressing stop, he rested the recorder on the railing. Below, a stray cat wandered through puddles of lamplight, tail held like a question mark. Somewhere, two neighbors laughed. The world had moved on, and he was moving with it. No more museums of grief, no more evidence filed under guilt. Just one steady rhythm of being alive. Inside, the clock struck 10. He liked those clean numbers, two simple lights standing side by side. The porch bulb hummed softly overhead, its filament a tiny sun. Morty thumbed through the notebook that had traveled with him through every chapter. The last entry he'd written, a few nights ago, sat waiting for its coda. At the bottom of the page, he added, experiment complete. Results inconclusive but hopeful. Next step, keep living like the experiment continues anyway. He closed the cover and set it on the table beside the cup. Coffee had cooled, but he didn't mind. Cooling meant time had done its ordinary job. From his chair, he could see the faint reflection of that porch light in the window across the street. One glow echoing another. Legacy didn't need grandeur, sometimes it just needed wattage. He thought back to the first bulb he'd ever seen Rick replace in their garage. The man had grumbled about faulty wiring and then muttered almost too softly, "Light's a stubborn habit." At the time, Morty had thought it nonsense. Now it sounded like scripture written in solder. He took a long breath, the kind that collects small details, paint smell, crisp air, the faint bitterness of coffee grounds, and filed them under proof of living. "All right," he said to nobody, or maybe to the air that carried Rick's humor somewhere distant. "Wes, that's the whole story." The porch light hummed in gentle agreement. He stayed there another hour, until stars had replaced the last fragments of sunset. When he finally stood, he turned off the recorder and closed the balcony door halfway, leaving just enough space for the night to look in. The light stayed on, some rituals need to. Turning toward his room, he said quietly, "Thanks for staying, old man. I got it from here." For a heartbeat, something flickered, not the bulb, but the air itself, a ripple of warmth, faint laughter and vibration instead of sound. Then it was gone, or maybe it stayed, invisible but constant. Morty smiled, rested a hand on the doorframe like sealing a chapter, and added softly, "Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's gonna be okay, man." The porch light glowed steady into the long, forgiving night.